Hello, my name is Sarah, and this evening I am starting a ghost story set in Edinburgh. It's called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, and this is chapter 1, The Drummer Boy. Charlie Wilson was a quiet boy. His parents moved around a lot, so he didn't have very many friends. He just kept himself to himself. He spent a lot of time sitting in his room playing with his PlayStation or trying to beat his own high score on some computer game. When he grew up, he wanted to be either a computer programmer or an air traffic controller, because then he'd get paid a lot to sit and press buttons all day. When I was young, I was out having some real adventures, instead of fooling around with some television game, Charlie's father said. When you were young, the television hadn't been invented, Charlie replied. Playing these games, I can have totally amazing adventures. I can become anyone I want. And his father sighed and nodded because secretly he thought that didn't sound like too bad an idea. He had no idea that Charlie Wilson was soon to have a totally amazing adventure, and that in the process he would become an explorer, a magician, a detective, and a grave robber. One day, just before the term ended, Charlie came home to find his mother doing handstands in the hall. Not that this was anything unusual, for his parents were both professional acrobats. This was a career that Charlie found highly embarrassing, so he pretended to everyone that they worked in a bank. Charlie didn't approve much of his parents. "Guess what?" his mother said upside down, her long hair brushing the hall floor. "You've found a new way to sweep?" "Ah, very funny." His mother gracefully flipped herself back on her feet. "We've been asked to perform at the Edinburgh International Festival up in Scotland. There's a whole show there dedicated to physical performance." "Ah, you mean it's a circus?" Charlie sighed. "Much, much classier than that. Not an elephant or a clown in sight." Charlie's father stuck his head out to the living room door and waggled his eyebrows. "This might even be our chance to get famous." Charlie had never actually heard of such a thing as a famous acrobat, and he certainly didn't want his parents to be the first. They would be absolutely insufferable. And he was even more horrified to learn that they were going to take him to Edinburgh with them. "Well, we certainly can't leave you behind, tempting though it may be." His father patted the boy on the shoulder. "It'll do you good to go somewhere different, bring you out of your shell." "What do you think I am?" said Charlie grumpily. "A mollusk?" "You'll love it," said his mother, doing a somersault, knocking over the umbrella stand. "We'll only be there for 3 weeks, and it's the biggest arts festival in the world. There are street performers, jugglers, music, comedy, plays. And all the bars stay open until 3 in the morning, said his father. "Not that that makes any difference to anything, mind you. We can do family things together for a change." His mother ruffled the boy's thick blonde hair before noticing that her nail varnish wasn't quite dry. "When we're not performing, of course, and how would you like to learn to juggle?" "I would rather chew my own arm off," said Charlie, rubbing the pink sticky patch left on his head. Didn't matter what he said, his parents took him to Edinburgh anyway. In Edinburgh, the city council had shut down a narrow disused street in an old part of the city and erected a huge fiberglass tent in the middle. It stretched from a derelict concert hall on one side of the road to a set of abandoned tenements on the other. Tenements was an old Scottish word for a very tall building. This was to be the special theatre where Charlie's parents and other acrobats would perform. 2 workmen stood watching the last of the scaffolding being removed. One was barely out of school, pale and scrawny, with so much acne he looked as if he was blushing. The other was nearly at a retiring age, his skin brown and cracked as an old door, and his thin white hair matted with the plaster dust. "Just like a circus big top, eh, Jim?" the younger one said, "only smaller." Jim nodded. He had long ago run out of things to say to his companion. "Hey, you hear about Harry?" the teenager continued. He seemed to dislike the silence. "Him and the lads were using a wee cellar at the bottom of those deserted flats for their breaks. Nice and cosy, eh? And out of sight of the gaffer," he added with a wink. Jim sighed and leant on his spade. The youngster took this as a sign of interest and kept going. He was fooling about with one of these pneumatic drills and knocked a hole right through the cellar wall. The youngster sniggered. Guess what? The lads said that they found a tunnel behind it. The older man didn't seem surprised. I've heard stories about tunnels under the streets ever since I was wee. When was that then, 19 oatcake? Ha ha! The teenager's snorted laugh turned into a fit of coughing. He pulled a cigarette from behind the greasy ear and lit it. There's a famous legend in Edinburgh, the more experienced man continued without a change of expression, about a bunch of soldiers fixing up the dungeons in Edinburgh Castle who found a hidden tunnel. I didn't hear about that. This was 200 years ago. Oh, the youth thought for a moment. I wasn't around then. Jim sighed and continued. The army wanted to know where the passage went, but it was awfully small, so they took a wee boy, gave him a drum to bang and chucked him in. The lad crawled into the darkness, and the soldiers followed on top, right out of the castle, down the main street. What happened? After about half a mile, the drumming stopped. Maybe he went on strike. Nobody knows what happened, the older man shrugged. The army decided just to forget the whole thing. They hid the tunnel again, and everyone thinks it was just a big daft story. Jim held out a warning finger. But late at night, if there's no traffic about, you're supposed to hear phantom drumming coming from below this very street. Load of nonsense, the teenager said cheerfully. Let's go and get a mug of tea. All legends have a grain of truth in them, lad, said Jim. Well, we'll find out soon enough, the boy said, grinning. We told the council about the tunnel, and it turns out that there's no official records about it, so they've offered us overtime to have a wee dig under the rest of the cellars, see if we could find anything else interesting. That's a bit odd, eh? Jim said thoughtfully. These buildings are almost 200 years old. They must have known about the tunnels, but they still built on top of them. There's no records, you say. Guy from the council said that they got destroyed about the same time as the tenements went up. The boy hefted his spade onto a skinny shoulder, impatient to get his mug of tea. Nothing left but legends. The old man looked up at the deserted windows, dark and empty as soulless eyes. He scratched his stubbled chin and frowned. It's like somebody long ago wanted what's under this street forgotten. That's the end of chapter 1. I hope you're going to enjoy this one. And guys, please wash your hands. It's really, really, really important. Now I want you to go into your bed, snuggle up, give yourself a great big huge cuddle because you deserve it. See you soon. Hello there, my name is Sarah and I am reading a ghost story set in Edinburgh. It's called Secret City and it's by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is chapter 2, The Tunnel. Once he got to Edinburgh, Charlie had to admit that he liked it, especially the historical Old Town. It was built on a defensive ridge leading up to Edinburgh Castle, and its tenements and stone spires towered over the rest of the city. Charlie imagined that the old town probably looked much the same now as it did centuries ago. There were plenty of things to see and do in a city filled with flowering gardens, ancient courtyards, hidden alleys and vast museums. And Charlie's mother had been right about the Edinburgh Festival. For 3 weeks, the city's streets were packed with jugglers, magicians, unicyclists, human statues and hundreds of other performers, all dressed in weird and wonderful costumes to promote their shows. All the same, he wished that he had been allowed to bring his PlayStation. There was one place that he did find fascinating, and that was the theatre, where his parents were to be performing. It was half theatre and half big top, tent-shaped, but made out of fiberglass rather than fabric. Like a theatre, its walls were rigid and had a door, rather like an enormous flap. Yet, it was as temporary as any circus tent, erected especially for the Edinburgh Festival and destined to be taken down again afterwards. And inside there was no stage or curtains because, as his father explained, this theatre was built just for acrobatic performances. None of your Shakespeare nonsense here, Charlie's father said happily. No men in tights running around shouting, "Thou hast killed me, naughty knave," and waving plastic swords. He pointed proudly to the girders, wires and poles that towered above them. When acrobats perform, it's a matter of life and death. There is real danger here. And that's a good thing? Charlie's father shrugged. Better than working in a bank. In fact, there was more danger in this particular big top than he could have possibly imagined. You can come and watch us practice if you like. Charlie's father was still staring longingly upwards. Perhaps one day you can be part of the act. I have already seen you practice, Charlie muttered. He'd lost count of the number of coffee tables that his parents had broken, leaping around the living room. The boy looked up at the rigid fiberglass roof. "Doesn't look all that dangerous to me," he said. The high wire isn't all that high, is it?" He pointed to a tight rope a few feet above their head, with a criss-cross mesh dangling just below it. "Anyway, there's a net." Charlie's father looked down at his son. "That is not the high wire," he said. "Ah, watch this." He took a remote control from a nearby table, pointed it at the roof and clicked a button. There was a loud hissing sound, and a crack of white appeared above the centre of the structure. The boy flinched. With an electronic hum, the two halves of the big top roof slid slowly back from the middle, like a huge mouth yawning, until the building was completely open to the sky. There was another hiss, and vertical poles, 40 feet apart and with a metal tightrope stretched between them, extended up and up through the gap that had been the roof and into the open air until the tightrope looked thin as thread. "That is the high wire," said Charlie's father in a whisper. "All right," Charlie admitted, taking the remote control and inspecting it. "I'm impressed." His stomach tightened at the thought of his parents balancing so high on the thinnest of wires, but he did like gadgets with buttons. The other thing that fascinated Charlie about the theatre was where it had been erected. It was in one of the narrow little roads that the inhabitants called wynds, which sloped steeply down from the high street, which is the main street of the old town, into the Cowgate, a run-down area festooned with pubs, much to the delight of Charlie's father. The boy liked the way that the big top was fastened to buildings on either side, rather than being secured by guy ropes, hammered into the ground like a normal circus tent. "They look like an ordinary bunch of flats, don't they?" Charlie's father said with a wink, pointing to the abandoned and crumbling tenements. "Well, they're not. These tenements happen to have been built in front of a gigantic bridge, but they were so tall that they made the structure behind almost invisible. This South Bridge was constructed in the 18th century so that horses and carts could cross the old town without risking the steep slopes of the Cowgate Valley. Under the massive bridge arches, hundreds of stone chambers linked by passages had been constructed, all easily accessible until the tenements had been built in front of them to hide them. These chambers were supposed to be used as storage vaults, but, according to Charlie's dad, people had ended up living there. In fact, Edinburgh was so overcrowded that the citizens even dug tunnels into the steep sides of the old town ridge, and then they inhabited them too. "You swallow a guidebook?" Charlie asked, frowning. "They call it the Underground City," said Charlie's father in a whisper. "The place where the very poorest people live." It was a long time ago, mind you, and it's all been built over or hidden, so lots of local people think that they never really existed. His father tapped the side of his nose, "But I know it does." "Oh, yeah, and how do you know?" Charlie was suddenly interested. After all, he'd been playing Tomb Raider for most of the spring. Charlie's father looked surprised. It wasn't often that he said something that his son actually wanted to hear. "Because the construction crew setting up the big top dug a bit of it up by mistake," he said, taking the boy by the arm. "Come on, have a look at this." He led his son over to the dark corner of the big top, where a door that the boy hadn't noticed lurked in the shadows. His father opened it, and they stepped into a short corridor. There was grubby plaster peeling from the walls, and the wooden slats and bare wires dangled from the roof. You can go from the big top right into the abandoned buildings, and behind there are the bridge vaults themselves. His father opened a second door and ushered Charlie through. It's like walking back in time. They now stood in a musty vault with a low roof and an uneven brickwork. It looked very, very old. The chamber contained a pile of shovels and drills and a folding table covered in dirty cups and a large portable generator which gave off an evil hum and smelt of burnt toast. The theatre construction crew had obviously used the little cellar to store their equipment and to have their tea breaks. Charlie's father moved a mop bucket and some plastic safety helmets stacked against the side of the generator. On impulse, he started juggling 3 of the helmets, but one bounced off the roof and hit the boy in the head. "Oops, sorry, Charlie," said his father. "Ceiling's a bit too low for that." Charlie wasn't listening. Behind the mop and the helmets was a ragged hole in the ancient brick wall, and even in the dim light of the makeshift bulb swinging from the storeroom ceiling, he could see that there was a tunnel on the other side. Is that part of the underground city? I think it has to be. Charlie's father switched on a lamp attached to one of the safety helmets and shone it into the hole. A narrow, moss-lined passage stretched into the distance as far as the beam could reach. The workman building the tent had found it. He knelt down beside Charlie and looked into the tunnel. "I bet nobody has been in there for 100 years or more. It's way too small for any of the workers to fit inside. Have you seen how many sandwiches these guys eat?" He stood up and began practicing juggling with the helmets again. "I hear the Edinburgh Council wants them to excavate the place properly." The boy stuck his head into the hole. There was a stale smell similar to the one inside his parents' fridge at home. His mother and father weren't too big on cleaning. "I bet I could fit in there." Charlie waved his hand about in the empty space. "Yeah, don't even think about it," warned his father, dropping the helmets with a crash. "I heard a story in a pub about a little boy who was forced into one of those abandoned passages and he never came out again. They say you can hear his ghost drumming under the ground." "I forget why he had a drum in the first place." He scratched his head. "To be honest, I don't remember much about that whole night." He put the mop and helmets back to hide the hole once more. Don't think of going down there again anyway." Charlie's father was sure his son had no intention of venturing anywhere near the tunnel again. He would rather sit in his room and play video games than have a proper adventure. Yeah, he forgot that Charlie hadn't been able to bring his PlayStation with him. The boy had already made the fateful decision. If he couldn't play Tomb Raider in the comfort of his own home, then he would just give the real thing a try. After all, better than wandering around Edinburgh on his own. Why, he might even discover treasure in this tunnel or find a gold mine or something. If Charlie had thought more carefully about his computer games, he would have realised that there is a sort of rule regarding hidden treasure. The rule is, wherever you find buried treasure, you're also likely to find something horrible guarding it. I think this is going to be a good one. Right, chaps, I hope you're enjoying this story, and I hope that you're all still washing your hands really, really well every single day. Now, I want you to get yourselves into your beds, snuggle down, give yourself a great big huge cuddle, and hopefully I will see you tomorrow. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I am reading a ghost story set in Edinburgh. It's called The Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, and this is Chapter 3, The Juggler. Visiting a new place has an odd effect on some people. Perhaps it's because nobody knows who they are, or that their routine has changed, or maybe the air is just different. Whatever the reasons, they sometimes find themselves acting quite out of the ordinary, and this was exactly what was happening to Charlie Wilson. The very next day he got up long before his mother and father and went down to breakfast on his own. The family were staying at a local guest house, and it was so early that the boy was the first one into the little dining room. The walls were covered in tartan wallpaper and faded pictures of funnily shaped birds. "Hello there, Sonny! Would you like a wee spot of Scottish breakfast?" A plump waitress with a beaming smile appeared at his table. "Scottish breakfast?" "Aye. Bacon, sausage, fried egg, fried tomato, fried bread, mushrooms, potato scone, black pudding, fruit pudding, haggis, hash browns, beans, chips, tea, toast and jam." Charlie swallowed hard. Do you have any Weetabix? I was hoping to actually be able to move today." "We've got porridge," said the waitress without batting an eyelid. "It's grey and it's lumpy, just like Weetabix." "I'll just have a glass of orange juice, thank you." Charlie's parents liked to think that they were very modern, as well as being rather busy, so they allowed their son to pretty much come and go as they pleased. They had given him a mobile phone in case of emergencies, but they were sure that he would never talk to strangers or go anywhere that looked even slightly dangerous. "We should be thankful that he is so ordinary, I suppose," Charlie's mother said to her husband. "When I was a child, I got into all sorts of trouble." "A child?" Charlie's father sighed. "We got thrown out of the pub last night after you did splits on the bar. But you're right, Charlie's not like us. He's a sensible boy." Which shows you that even parents can be wrong. After breakfast, Charlie headed straight for the big top, intending to explore the mysterious tunnel. His father had given the boy a key for the theatre just in case he wanted to come and watch the rehearsals. Acrobats couldn't exactly come down from their trapeze to answer the door. Charlie had no desire to watch his parents go through their act, for he was convinced that one day they would fall and break every bone in their bodies. But he knew that the big top was deserted in the mornings, and his parents hated to get up early. Charlie supposed that all performers were kind of the same. As soon as he was inside the big top, he made his way to the shadowy door at the back, crossed through the abandoned building and entered the bridge vault. He moved the mops and the buckets away from the passage, took one of the construction helmets, switched on the light, and he fastened it onto his head. It was far too big, but Charlie's thick hair acted like a cushion and stopped the hard hat falling over his eyes. Then he looked into the tunnel opening. The passage was damp and dark, and he had no idea what was at the end of it. It might be an underground cliff, or a bogeyman, or worse, the tunnel might get smaller and smaller until he found himself trapped forever. On the other hand, there might be some sort of forgotten treasure down there, like they found under the pyramids. What sort of supercomputer could he buy then? He put his hand tentatively into the dank opening, and a cold draught raised goosebumps on his flesh. He shivered violently all over. Who do I think I am, Indiana Jones? Charlie withdrew his arm, backed away from the hole, shaking his head. I wouldn't crawl down there if my life depended on it. He stood up and hurried back to the big top again, still shivering from his sudden attack of the heebie-jeebies. I'll go find a computer store instead, he muttered. See what the latest releases are. He stopped in surprise, halfway to the outside door. Oh, hello? In the middle of the theatre, shrouded in shadow, stood a girl in a short velvet dress. She was juggling, not 3 balls or 4, but 6 or 7 bright green orbs, and they glittered intermittently as they spun around her back and over her head. Hi there! The girl turned and spoke without missing a beat. She looked about Charlie's age, and her eyes and dress were as bright a green as her juggling balls. I didn't think that anyone performed here in the morning, Charlie said. I'm not a performer, the girl replied, her hands a blur of motion. My father's a magician. I'm practicing to be as good as him. Really? Charlie pointed to the spinning balls. That's not magic though, is it? It's just juggling. The girl arched an eyebrow and let her arms drop to her side. The balls scattered across the theatre floor like startled frogs and vanished under the audience chairs. Charlie grimaced. Perhaps that hadn't been the right way to start the conversation. My parents are one of the acts here too, he said pleasantly, trying to start again. They're acrobats. The girl nodded as if she already knew. Do you think you'll ever be as good as him? As them? Me? said Charlie awkwardly. I don't want to be an acrobat. The girl looked up at the trapeze dangling above. Yeah, I suppose it must be quite frightening up there. Not that I'm afraid, Charlie said, embarrassed by the misunderstanding. But why do something dangerous just for the sake of it? Yeah, is that why you decided not to explore in the tunnel? Eh? I've seen it too. The girl gave a sly smile that Charlie didn't much like. In the broom cupboard at the back of the theatre. Very dark. Charlie felt himself go red. What makes you think I'm interested in exploring some stupid tunnel? Well, you've got a hard hat with a light on its head. Yeah, well, I was going to check it out, the boy blustered. I just came back to make sure that the theatre door was locked. It is, said the girl. I'll keep an eye on the place while you finish exploring. Don't worry. She walked over and straightened his helmet. My name is Lily. I'm Charlie, replied Charlie, at a loss for anything else to say. Then he sighed and headed back towards the storage vault. Charlie hunkered down beside the generator, staring into the tunnel once more. Surely he wasn't going to go in there just to prove to some weird girl that he wasn't scared. Then the boy thought of his parents. He had never understood why they wanted to risk their lives swinging high above the ground. He'd asked his father once, but he had just laughed gently. I don't want to grow dull and fat working as some banker or salesman, Charlie, he tried to explain. You only live once, so you may as well really live. At the time, Charlie hadn't understood what he meant, but now he wondered if, for once, his father might be proud that he was taking a chance. Anyway, he had his mobile phone if he got into trouble. With a deep breath, Charlie knelt down and slid headfirst into the tunnel. The moss on the wall was surprisingly dry, and it was spongy, which made crawling easy. After a few dozen yards, he realised that the little channel was beginning to widen. Another 50 feet, and the tunnel opened out into another passage, this one large enough for Charlie to stand. Wow! I am in the underground city, he whispered to himself, looking around in awe. The flashlight on his helmet lit up an ancient curved roof, dripping with thin fingers of hardened salt. This is well and truly the stupidest thing I have ever done. He might be taking a chance, but Charlie Wilson certainly wasn't stupid. He took a piece of chalk from his pocket. He'd bought a packet just the other day before, especially for this. He marked a crumbling but readable number on the chamber wall. Then he set off down the larger passage. He passed several openings leading into vaults of different sizes, and the tunnel itself twisted left, then right, but every time he turned, Charlie chalked another number so that he would be able to find his way back. Lara Croft was never smart enough to do this, he said proudly, just before he tripped and fell flat on his face. The mobile phone flew out of his shirt pocket, bounced away into the dark, and as Charlie scrabbled after it, his helmet bumped against the wall of the tunnel and his outstretched arms vanished into a hole between the wall and the floor. He withdrew it with a shriek, just in case some big rat or land octopus was lurking inside. Oh, for goodness sake, he panted once he calmed down a bit. How many hidden holes are in this blasted place? He sat up and played the headlight over the little opening, which was no more than a few inches long, obstructed by dirt and loose rubble. This is great. I couldn't have aimed the phone down there if I was a champion darts player. How am I going to explain this to my mum and dad? The answer, of course, was that, well, he couldn't. He was going to have to try and rescue his mobile. The hole was half hidden behind bricks and short straps of wood, and Charlie began to move the debris to see if he could make a space big enough to reach in. Soon he realised that the gap was going to be large enough to fit his head and his shoulders through, and though he really didn't like that idea, it meant he could actually see where the mobile had gone. After a few deep breaths, he clenched his fists and stuck his head into the hole. Would you look at that? The light on his hard hat lit up a small stone stairway leading down into the darkness. His mobile phone must have bounced all the way down to the bottom. Charlie was aware that bit by bit he was going further than he had ever intended. I'm brave, I'm brave, I'm brave. My mum and dad are brave, and I can be brave too, the boy chanted, fastening the helmet strap tighter with trembling fingers. Yeah, who am I kidding? I'm just a lot dumber than I thought. Then he crawled right through the widened hole, fumbling his way to his feet, and made his way cautiously down the stairs. At the bottom was another passage, damp, with an uneven floor and sloping gently downwards. Charlie picked up his phone, which was lying in the middle of the tunnel again, and then, on impulse, carried it on down the hill. Despite himself, the boy found that he was thrilled as well as frightened, and he understood for the first time how his parents must feel swinging around on their trapeze. He was a bit disappointed, in fact, when the tunnel eventually opened out into a large vault that seemed to signal the end of his journey. Charlie swung the light around, but the doorway he stood in was both the entrance and the exit to the chamber. The vault wasn't completely empty. A large pyramid-shaped wooden frame and a rusty iron hook leant against one wall. There was a mound of rocks in the far corner and a build-up circle of stone in the middle. Charlie walked over to the brick circle, which was about waist height, and he bent his head to shine the torch down into it. The beam lit up a thick layer of ash and lumpy grey remains of what must have once been coal. "Looks like someone's been having a barbecue." Charlie raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't be my choice of place for a picnic." He turned and walked towards the smaller pile of stones. Though it was no more than a heap of rocks, it looked as if it had been put there deliberately. He hesitated for a few seconds, and he threw caution to the wind. "The last time I came across a pile of stones, it was hiding something." The boy bent down and began to remove the rocks. "Doesn't seem right to come all this way and not see what's under this lot, especially if it's a chest full of jewels." The stones were piled on top of a rotting wooden board, and while Charlie had uncovered most of the plank, he slid it aside. Underneath was a blackened hollow cylinder of metal, the size of an oil drum. It looked as if it had been rammed into the hole in the floor. Charlie peered inside, and a grin spread across his dusty face. At the bottom of the cylinder was a square object wrapped in dark cloth. It looked as if it might be some kind of box. "Treasure," Charlie breathed. "About time, too." Lying flat on the floor, he reached into the metal-lined hole, grasped the coarse cloth, and pulled it towards him. It was certainly a package of some kind, wrapped in a crumbling remains of what looked suspiciously like a huge leather glove. With trembling hands, the boy unpeeled the leather, but inside there was only a tatty book with a faded vellum cover. "Oh, a book," the boy sighed. "If I wanted a book, I could have gone to the library." He gingerly opened the fragile cover, and a slip of folded paper fell out. He couldn't tell from the light of the torch, but he guessed it was yellow with age, for it crackled when he picked it up. "A treasure map!" Of course. He unfolded the paper, bent his helmet closer to see what was written there. The words were hand-scripted, but the letters were large and thick, making it easy to read, even in the dim torchlight. "If you are reading this, you are in mortal danger. Take the book, leave now, and cover your tracks. I pray you are brave at heart and of good character, and if so, read on, and then do what you must." Charlie sat bolt upright. "Mortal danger," he gasped. "What does it mean, mortal danger?" Then the tapping began. It was very soft, and it was very faint, as if it were a long way down, somewhere under the floor. Charlie's eyes widened and he sprang to his feet. Already, rapping was growing louder, and it was getting faster too, though it still sounded far off. There was no doubt in the boy's mind the noise was heading this way. The blood drained from Charlie's face and his bravado evaporated. He began to back out of the vault, stuffing the book into his shirt as he went. The rapping was more like a drumming now, much louder, definitely heading in his direction. It was approaching fast. Charlie Wilson turned and ran. His journey back to the surface was little more than a blur, for the terrified boy ran like he'd never run before, his breathing hammering in his ears and the light on his head swirling sinister shadows across the passages. The chalk marks flew past. 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then 1. He spread through the corridors, bouncing off the walls, stumbling over loose rocks, until he plunged back into the little tunnel, ignoring the scrapes in his hands, and he frantically scrambled the last 100 yards. He didn't slow down until he had burst into the tool-filled vault, and every mop, bucket and teacup had been piled back in front of the tunnel entrance. Charlie took the helmet from his head, placed it on the vault floor with the others. His hands were shaking so badly, he could hardly switch off the light on the front. He was trembling on the floor, his chest heaving. Thank God I didn't have the full Scottish breakfast, he panted. I would still be down there. He got unsteadily to his feet and opened the door leading back into the theatre. Nobody, and I mean nobody, will ever make me go back into that tunnel, he promised, taking one last look at the covered-up hole. I will never set foot in that place again as long as I live. But though he meant every word, Charlie Wilson couldn't have been more wrong. Now, clean teeth, wash your hands properly, get yourselves into your bed, and snuggle in and give yourself a great big huge cuddle. And I'll see you tomorrow. Night-night. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading a ghost story set in Old Edinburgh. It's called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, and this is chapter 4, The Book. Lily was still juggling when Charlie staggered back into the theatre. He could have sworn for a second that she had at least a dozen balls in the air, and what looked like a couple of mice as well. At the sound of the boys wheezing, the whirling objects vanished into some hidden pocket that jugglers always seemed to have. Lily smiled innocently. Ah, you're back. Anything interesting down there? Interesting. Charlie slapped at his jeans, and a cloud of white dust rose into the air. I heard the ghost of the little drummer boy, the one that's supposed to haunt the place. My heart almost stopped. He began to tell Lily about the drumming, but to his annoyance the little girl started to laugh. She held up a hand to stop him. Charlie, there's a group of council workmen digging under the tenements from the opposite side of the bridge. I saw them going into work this morning, and you probably heard them drilling. It sounded like drummers to me. The boy scowled, and I've never been so scared. A phantom drummer, eh? You should have stuck around. The rest of the band might have turned up. Charlie ignored her sarcasm and pulled the book from under his shirt, releasing another cloud of dust. Anyway, I found this. Really? Let me see. Lily took the book and opened it. She looked intrigued. It's handwritten. The date inside the cover says 1824. She turned a page and read a little more. It's the journal of somebody called William Makepeace. Like a diary. Yeah, exactly. Is it a joke, some kind of a hoax? Lily shook her head. There are parts of the underground city that have been sealed for almost 2 centuries, and this book is definitely old. See how crackly the paper is. She peered over the top of the pages at Charlie. What are you looking so unhappy about? I suppose this is real too. The boy unfolded the note and handed it to Lily. It was inside the front page. It's the same type of paper. She read the message and looked up at him with her eyes sparkling. This is great! Yeah, fantastic. Especially the part about me being in mortal danger. Charlie pointed to the offending sentence. What do you think it means? Don't you see? Lily said excitedly. The note's a warning to stop people from going any further. It worked then, Charlie snorted. I came back as soon as I read it. Yeah, but think, why would anybody leave a note like that? Lily waved the offending scrap of paper under Charlie's nose. I bet it's because there's something really important hidden down there, see? And only the stout of heart will be able to find it. Lily nodded as if this made perfect sense. That note is a clue, but it's also a warning, see? Treasure! A look of horror suddenly crossed her face. What if those council workers are heading towards it? You said the note was inside the book. Lily was obviously swept up with her grand idea. Maybe the book says where the treasure is buried. You're getting totally carried away. Charlie held up his hands. It's just some old diary, that's all. We should give it to a museum or something before it gets damaged. Yeah, well, we could do that. Lily smiled a dazzling smile. But it wouldn't do any harm to read it first. Where's your sense of adventure? I left it in the tunnel. Look, it would only take a couple of days to read through the book. If there's nothing about treasure, you can hand it over to anybody you like. Yeah, and if there is, Lily shrugged, then, well, you can decide what to do next. Oh, well, since you've got it all worked out... Charlie gave a sigh of exasperation that somehow turned into a laugh halfway through. Lily laughed as well. Oh, come on, Charlie, it is quite exciting, she said, nudging him. I suppose I could take it back to the guest house and have a look. But didn't they write really boring books in those days, with big, long sentences? Charlie took the diary back from Lily and opened it. I'm not really into reading. I like computer games. Lily snorted. Charlie scanned the first page, scowling with concentration. His frown deepened as he read aloud. This is the journal of myself, William Makepeace, aged about 12. Though I'm not sure what year I was born, for I am an orphan, in which I am determined to tell of my life and adventure, since it is my great desire to someday write a book of great importance. I knew it, Charlie groaned. I've written school essays that were shorter than this first sentence, and who taught him how to spell? Look, if he was an orphan in the underground city, he probably taught himself. Lily arched a sarcastic eyebrow. Think you could do that? The boy ignored her and began to read again. I lived in the Canongate poorhouse until I found I was to be apprenticed to Macpherson the sweep, who was well known for his ill treatment of boys in his employ. He would send them up the narrowest chimneys, and should they become stuck, we would light fires under them to persuade them out. Ouch! Charlie paused. He's got to be making this up. Nobody's life could be that bad. Lily looked solemn. In those days, everybody's life was bad, unless they had money. Well, some things never change. The boy smiled thinly and began to read again. One night I escaped by leaping from the poorhouse roof into a drift of snow and remaining buried until after dark. Finally, half dead with cold, I made my way to the underground city where all manner of criminals reside, and now make my living by means that I am ashamed to mention. Wow! Charlie looked up from the book in astonishment. This guy has had some life, and I'm only on the first page. I wonder what he did that he was so ashamed of. Read the journal, you'll probably find out. Oh, it's too difficult, the boy protested. I'll never get through it. Everyone has a story worth hearing, Lily said. You just need to be able to picture it. She held out a fist. Maybe I can help. She uncurled her fingers, blew across her palm, and a cloud of glittering dust circled the boy's head. What are you doing? Charlie waved his arms about, scattering a shiny haze. I've got asthma, you know. It's imagination to help you read the book. It's glitter, Lily. Charlie held up a sparkly hand in disgust, and now I look like a girl. Oh, as you were so quick to point out, I'm only a juggler, Lily shrugged. What do you want me to do? Pull a rabbit out of my... I'll read the book, all right? The boy stuffed the journal back inside his shirt. I'll let you know how far I've got by tomorrow. Where do you stay? What's your phone number? He tapped his shirt pocket proudly. I have a mobile. Lily gestured to the theatre behind her. You can find me right here every morning. Oh, suit yourself. Charlie went to the door and unlocked it. He paused with his key in the lock and turned back. See this mortal danger stuff? Just what kind of mortal danger do you think? Oh. But Lily was gone. Who is this mysterious Lily? Anyway, guys, I hope that you enjoyed that story. And I hope that you have washed your hands and cleaned your teeth and gone into your bed and given yourself a great big huge cuddle because you deserve it. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow for the next chapter. Night-night. Hello there, my name is Sarah and I'm reading a ghost story set in old Edinburgh. It's called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, and this is chapter 5, The Graveyard. After dinner at the guest house, Charlie's parents got ready to go to the big top and perform their act. Do you want to come and watch? Said his father, pulling on a pair of yellow spangled tights. I think I'll just stay in and read. Charlie shook his head. You're not going to walk through town dressed like that, are you? Oh, don't worry, Charlie. Everyone will be staring at your mother. Charlie's mother appeared to be wearing nothing more than 3 ostrich feathers. And you don't need to wait up. We thought we might go for a drink after the show. That's if we don't plunge to our deaths from the high wire. Only joking. As soon as his parents were gone, Charlie pulled the diary from his bag, flopped onto his bed and began to read. William Makepeace had close, shaky handwriting that made his long, badly spelt sentences even more difficult to read. My best friend and constant companion is a boy a little older than I, Duncan MacPhail, who was my great fortune to meet, for his strength is admirable and his bravery beyond question, and it was he who persuaded me to give up my dishonourable profession. Oh, Charlie felt his eyes drooping already. Hadn't this boy ever heard of full stops? He tried to remember what Lily had said about using his imagination and concentrating on the story rather than the words. Charlie had to admit it. He wanted to know what this William Makepeace did that was so terrible. Apart from not learning to punctuate sentences, he looked at the book again. I was sitting in Greyfriars Graveyard when I met Duncan for the first time. A fine spring day when the trees were heavy with white and pink blossoms. Charlie tried ignoring the writing and concentrate on what the writer was actually saying. He pictured ornate gravestones, stately trees ruffled by a cool spring breeze. And then the strangest thing happened. In his head, he could suddenly see a small boy sitting on a flat tombstone and writing in a book. William Makepeace looked up at the scented blossom drifting past his head and landing on the vellum-covered journal balanced between his knees. 200 yards away, through the scattered gravestones, he could see a group of mourners in black frock coats and tall stovepipe hats attending a funeral. The boy watched them out of the corner of his eye and then took a quill pen and an ink pot from his pocket, dipped the nib and carefully made some notes. A shadow fell across the flat tombstone on which he sat, and he looked up in surprise. 3 angry-looking youths, one holding a stout club, stood over him, their burly form blocking out the sun. We know what you're up to, pal. One of the youths slammed the stick down on the flat stone an inch from the boy's knee. The mourners didn't look round. You're going to wish you'd never set foot in this graveyard. Now then, I was already thinking it was a bad idea, the boy said pleasantly, shutting the book. So, I'll be on my way, gents, and we'll say no more about it. Think you're clever, do you? The largest of the 3 boys nodded to his ragged companions. Grab his arms, I'm going to teach this wee sod a lesson. As the toughs moved forward to seize the boy, they heard a cough from behind the nearby tree, and a tall youth stepped into the sunlight. I don't think that 3 big lads against 1 wee one is fair, no matter what he's done, the stranger said calmly. His hair was long and black, and a thick tartan plaid was draped over his shoulder, then fastened around his waist with an ornate pin. His strange attire marked him out as a Highlander, not a common sight in the city, which still treated the fierce clans of northern Scotland with fear and mistrust. He kept himself between the sun and his assailants, so that his features were difficult to make out. This is no your fight, friend. The largest youth stepped forward menacingly, shading his eyes with his hand. Go about your business and leave us to ours. I don't mind if he joins in, said William Makepeace. I think it would even up the odds nicely as One of the gang lashed out, the back of his calloused hand catching Makepeace a glancing blow on the temple, knocking him backwards off the tombstone. Without a second's hesitation, a Highlander launched himself forward, head down, arms spread wide. His shoulder crashed into the gang leader's chest, and his outstretched fist slammed into the stomachs of the henchmen on either side. Next moment, all 3 toughs were on the ground, gasping for air, and the Highlander was standing above them, brandishing the stick. In his other hand, a small but deadly-looking knife had appeared. Go on, get out before I cut you. He motioned towards the cemetery's iron gates, and the gang got unsteadily to their feet and ran. The knife vanished into the Highlander's tunic, and he helped the little boy to his feet. "Up you get, wee man. You all right?" He bent down and retrieved the fallen book. "I'm fine, thank you, and most indebted to you for saving me." The boy held out his hand. "My name's William Makepeace, but my friends call me Beazle, and so do my enemies for that matter, and I obviously have quite a few." The Highlander shook the hand. "Duncan MacPhail from Afton House. I didn't have any enemies," he smiled. "At least not alive." "Then I will count you a friend," said Beazle. "May I have my journal back?" "This is a funny kind of book now, isn't it?" Duncan opened the journal and looked at the first page. "I've been watching you write in it, and yet there's nothing here." He flicked through the remaining pages until you get to the back. That is, and then there's a map of the cemetery. He motioned to the crowd of mourners clustered around the open grave like unhappy shadows. "And you've been making a wee tick, marking the spot where the funeral has taken place." "It's my hobby," the boy said casually. "Funeral spotting." The Highlander's eyes narrowed. "It's my guess that you work for the Resurrection Men, and that's why the Yang wished you harm." He looked at the stout stick and then back at Beazle. "I heard stories of such a thing, but I never believed that they were true." The Resurrection Men were the most despised of the city's many criminals, for they stole bodies from graveyards and sold them for unscrupulous scientists at Edinburgh University to experiment on. To avoid suspicion, they often employed children as lookouts or had them mark out the sites of recently buried corpses. Then the body snatchers could return at night, rob the grave without falling over a dozen headstones in the dark. Beazle was quick to defend himself. "You think it's easy for an orphan living in this city? I have to eat, you know." He angrily snatched the book from the larger boy. "I pick pockets too. I might as well tell you. It's either that or I get sent up some chimney for a living and maybe suffocate down a Lothian mine opening a trapdoor for coal carts." The Highlander placed a hand on the smaller boy's shoulder. "Calm down, my friend. I know what it's like to go hungry myself. I was forced to come down from the Highlands because there's no work to be had in the north." He spat on the ground in anger. "I've been here for over a week, and I must admit I'm faring no better." "No luck?" "Oh, I have a job in an iron foundry where I work from 6 in the morning until 8 at night for a few pennies. I sleep in a doorway because there's no lodgings to be had." The pickpocket could see that Duncan's piercing blue eyes were ringed by dark circles, and his fine cheekbones were made even sharper by exhaustion. It suddenly occurred to Beazle that his new friend could only be a couple of years older than the pickpocket himself, perhaps 14 or 15. The Highlander looked around at the laden boughs and the lush green grass. "I like it here, because it's the only place in this overcrowded hellhole of a city where I can get a wee bit of peace," he said. Beazle could see what he meant. Though dirty tenements surrounded the high walls of Greyfriars, the graveyard held only the funeral party, a courting couple, and a few disrespectful orphans playing hide-and-seek. Tranquility like that was rare in overcrowded Edinburgh, for famine and unsympathetic landowners had forced wave after wave of immigrants from the Scottish and Irish countryside to move to the cities. The population of the old town had doubled in the last 30 years. "I seen a hawk here yesterday," said Duncan. "A white one, with black tips on each wing. I've never seen anything like it before. Didn't look right in such a dirty sky." The Highlander grabbed a falling blossom and sniffed at it, but no fragrance could block out the smell of coal smoke and sewage that permeated the city. "I come here a lot myself," said the pickpocket, "not just to spy on the funerals," he added quickly. He patted the gravestone on which he'd been sitting. "I always sit here on the grave of Alan Ramsay. He was a great poet, you know, and a man of learning, and yet he started off as a humble shepherd, so I heard." "Nothing wrong with being a shepherd," said Duncan with a scowl. "Listen, you help me," the little pickpocket said. "I'd like to return the favour. If you know where to stay, then you're welcome to lodge with me for a while." Duncan thought for a second, then he leant back behind the gravestone and picked up a small knapsack. "Your hospitality is worthy of a Highlander himself, and I gladly accept. Where do you stay?" "The underground city." That sounds powerful grim. So does sleeping in a doorway. Come on. He led Duncan out of the graveyard, up the old town ridge onto the high street. For a few minutes they pushed their way through the crowds, thronging between the bristling tenements, until Peasel turned down a narrow and steeply sloping sewage-filled alley. "The South Bridge," said Peasel as they neared the bottom. "Home, sweet home." The boys stood in the shadow of the bridge's towering pillars, its grimy brick flanks studded with openings leading to internal vaults. The chambers, which had been designed to hold goods and wares, but because of Edinburgh's horrific overcrowding, now held people. The tenements that would eventually hide the vault entrances had not yet been built, but Peasel and the Highlander simply stepped from the street into the interior of the bridge. "This is my vault," Peasel finally pointed to a smoky chamber where 3 men were playing cards by candlelight. "It's smelly and it's dark, and you might get murdered in your bed, but at least it's dry." There was a squelch as he stepped through the doorway. Well, dry-ish. "It smells to high heaven." The Highlander wrinkled his nose. "You actually pay for this." "I pay Merry Andrew." Peasel lowered his voice and indicated one of the card players. The man slowly rose to his feet. Once he was standing, he had to stoop to avoid hitting his head on the roof. "He's the biggest, so the vault belongs to him." The little pickpocket turned to the rough-looking man. His face was a rash of pockmarks and grey stubble, except for where a large scar ran from ear to chin. "Mary, this is Duncan MacPhail from the Highlands, and I want to share my space with him for a while." Merry Andrew looked far from merry. In fact, he looked as if he could tear almost most men apart with his bare hands, and he was in the mood to do it. "Oh, really? And suppose I don't want Duncan MacPhail in my vault," he growled, his voice broken by a lifetime of loud cursing and cheap grog. "You think this place isn't crowded enough?" He towered over the 2 boys. "I reckon I'll throw Duncan out of my vault and charge you double for even suggesting it." "Then Duncan might come back in the middle of the night and cut off your ears while you sleep." The Highlander spoke softly, but the small knife glinted in his hand once more. "If you're going to make enemies so easily, it's better to keep them close so you can see what they're up to." There was a stunned silence. The other card players looked at each other and gave a low whistle. Merry Andrew glowered, then he half smiled, then he laughed out loud. "Well spoken, Highlander," he said, slapping Duncan on the back. "I like your spirit. Help me a week and you can stay. I collect the money prompt each Friday." Peasel finally let his breath out. Later that night, Merry Andrew and his companions went to the local tavern to play dice. "Where did you get such a fine book?" Duncan picked up Peasel's journal. "Looks expensive. I see you've got an expensive quill pen too." "Stole it from one of the bookstalls in Blair Street," the pickpocket said. "I've always wanted to write something of value, like men of learning do." "Taught myself to read in the poorhouse, I did." "I can't read nor write myself," said the Highlander. "Where I come from, it's more important to learn to hunt and fight." He lay down in the pile of rough sacks and straw that served as bedding in the underground city. "Still, it seems a shame to waste such a bonny book." "What do you mean?" "Why don't you stop using it to do the body snatcher's dirty work? Keep a proper diary instead." The Highlander blew out the candle, plunging the vault into darkness. "Someone might want to read it for years from now, and then you will live forever." "I doubt that," said the pickpocket, but he lay awake for a long time, smiling in the dark. He had a proper friend at last, and to show his gratitude, he would take his friend's advice. I've got to stop doing all these throaty voices. Anyway, chaps, I hope that you've cleaned your teeth. I hope that you've washed your hands today. I want you now to snuggle into your bed, give yourself a great big huge cuddle. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Night night. Hello, my name is Sarah, and I am reading a ghost story called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. And this is chapter 6, The Giant. The next morning, Charlie burst into the big top in a state of high excitement. Lily was balancing 3 chairs, one on top of each other, on the end of her chin. "I read the diary last night. Well, some of it. It was amazing. Just like I was there. In fact, I don't even know if I dreamt it." He stopped mid-tirade. "Oh, is that not a bit heavy?" "It is just an illusion," Lily said without taking her eyes off the chairs. "You seem very animated this morning." "It's this diary. It was written by a boy called Peasel, a real boy, from 200 years ago. He had a best friend, Duncan. He'd come down from the Highlands to look for work in Edinburgh." Charlie spread his arms, trying to convey the enormity of what he was saying. "It wasn't like I was reading, it was like I was seeing what went on." "It must be quite a book." "You don't understand. I can't explain it, but somehow I'm not just reading it. The book had only sketchy details, and I only read a couple of pages, but I still know what went on in their lives. Stuff that's not even written down." Charlie pulled the diary from his rucksack. "Listen, I've got to go to Greyfriars Graveyard." Lily jerked her head back, and the chairs collapsed in perfect formation, stacking neatly as they landed. Charlie blinked. "Why Greyfriars Graveyard?" she said sharply. I want to see where Peasel liked to hang out. He used to write on a grave of some guy called Alan Ramsay. Duncan liked it too because it had hawks, just like in the Highlands." "Hawks?" Lily scowled. "Well, one hawk, white with black-tipped wings." Charlie held up the book. "You want to come?" "No, I don't." The girl turned sharply away. "I have to practice." "Are you all right?" Charlie said. But Lily had begun to juggle again, 7 balls, then 8, then 10, so fast it was merely a blur. She didn't turn round as he left, and he got the strange feeling that the girl was suddenly upset and was trying to hide it. Greyfriars was only a few hundred yards from the old town, but you could walk straight past it without knowing it, for the cemetery was hidden by a high wall and was still ringed by old buildings. Charlie was lucky to spot the entrance, set back from the street, behind a pub and a row of small shops. He let out a gasp as he walked through the wrought iron gates. Dotted between the trees were lovingly carved gravestones, now weathered with age, and behind that, a high backdrop of grey Georgian tenements, exactly as he had seen them the night before. The boy walked round the side of the squat barn-like church that faced the gates. There was the flat tombstone that marked the final resting place of Alan Ramsay, right where he knew it would be. "This is more than a little weird," Charlie muttered to himself, taking the journal from his bag. The flat, worn stone was warm from the summer sun, and on impulse he lay down on it, looking around to see if anyone disapproved. But the graveyard, hidden behind its double barricade, seemed to be deserted, so Charlie opened the book and began to read. "Sunday is the only day when Duncan does not work at a factory, so we arranged to meet on the high street in the afternoon, for in the morning he was paying his respects to a gypsy girl who sings for money in Blair Street and with whom he is much taken. I was in powerful good spirits, for I had relieved more than one rich merchant of his gold snuff box that week." Peasel walked slowly down the high street, looking out for Duncan. Like all thoroughfares in the old town, the high street was packed with people, strolling and gossiping, and it smelt strongly of sewage. For the ground was not paved, and waste and rubbish was often thrown out of the windows at night. The air was filled with the shouts of fruit sellers and fishwives plying their wares from rickety wooden stalls, planted in the stagnant mud. He finally found Duncan, sitting on a stone stoop and looking glum. "I presume things didn't go entirely well with your girl this morning?" Peasel hunkered down beside his friend, trying to look sympathetic. "She's no my girl, a pretty lassie whose company I like." Duncan poked dejectedly in the mud with his foot. "I'm fond of her, and she can sing love ballads fit to break a heart. But I'm a plain-spoken lad and not much for romantic talk." "Well, don't ask me for advice, because I'm too scrawny for courting. You fancy a bag of buckies?" Peasel pointed to a stall selling little saucers of cockles covered with salt and pepper. "I didn't want to eat anything that looked like it came out of somebody's nose," the Highlander grunted. Peasel bought a saucer anyway. He had taken to hanging around Edinburgh's bookstalls to hear what the learned gentlemen who browsed there were saying. Usually he didn't understand a word, but he could grab a silk handkerchief or a gold coin from their back pockets as they strolled by. Last week, the pickpocket had overheard one gent saying that eating fish made people smarter, and he decided that seafood was his best bet for getting an education. Since cockles were the only kind of marine life that he could actually afford, Peasel had taken to eating them whenever he got the chance. The two boys sat on a cracked step while Peasel shovelled cold, slimy shellfish into his mouth and Duncan glowered at the thronging crowds. The Highlander badly missed the solitude of his heather-covered moors. Here he could only see slivers of sky between the tenement blocks, and even those thin patches were tainted by thick palls of chimney smoke. Duncan would have liked to get out into the grimy, overcrowded city for the day, but Peasel insisted that he was scared of the countryside. The pickpocket had lived his whole life in the slums, and he wasn't about to venture into the wilderness where he might get eaten by a wild animal, especially a camel. Peasel was deadly afraid of camels. "There is no camels in the Scottish countryside, I am sure of it," Duncan muttered. "Have you ever seen a camel?" Peasel asked. "I don't even know what a camel looks like." Well, there you go then," said Peasel triumphantly. "The countryside could be full of man-eating camels and you wouldn't know it." Duncan wouldn't give up. "We could go and climb up Arthur's Seat." The Highlander pointed south to where the craggy hilltop could be glimpsed through the swirling smoke in the chimney pots. "It's not exactly the countryside now, is it, if you can see it from here?" Peasel looked at his friend in horror. "You must be joking. When that thing blows up, I don't want to be standing on top of it." Idling outside his favourite bookstall the week before, Peasel had been horrified to hear two learned gents talking about Arthur's Seat being an extinct volcano with a vast network of tunnels underneath. Once he'd asked around and found out what a volcano was, Peasel vowed never to set foot on the hill again. He was still trying to find out what extinct meant, though. He half-heartedly offered the Highlander a cockle, but Duncan waved it away with a snort. Peasel could see that his friend was in a foul mood, but he wasn't about to go climbing over a volcano just to cheer him up. Duncan sighed loudly. "Tell you what," the pickpocket said finally, "I will buy us some decent food for tonight, eh? I've had a good week and it is time to sell what I've acquired." He wiped his greasy hands down his trousers and inspected his nimble fingers with pride. "I mean, we'll have to go back to the underground city for a bit, if you don't mind. If I'm getting something other than boiled turnip for supper, I'm willing to trek through the very gates of hell." "Funny you should say that," Peasel grinned awkwardly as he stood. "Come on, let's get this over with." Duncan's mood was black as they marched back to the shadows of the South Bridge, stepping out of the sunlight and entering the familiar dark corridor that led to their vault. This time, however, the boys continued past the rude dwelling and carried on down the passageway. The Highlander had never been in this direction before. He spent as much time as he could on the surface, and he had no inclination to delve deeper into the black, smelly corridors. "Never thought we'd end up back here on my day off," he muttered, tripping over a sleeping figure curled up on the tunnel floor. The passages, like every other part of Edinburgh, were festooned with down-and-outs who slept when they felt like it. Why not? In the permanent darkness of the underground city, it was always night. "Here we are," Peasel whispered finally, crouching beside a damp wall. "There's a set of stairs behind a little opening down here. Most people don't even know it exists." His hunched form moved forward, and without warning, he was gone. Puzzled, Duncan shuffled one near invisible foot around in front of him where the wall met the floor and felt a small opening. He could have passed by it 100 times in the blackness without even realising it was there. He sat down, wriggling his body through the gap, and leaning carefully on the slimy wall, inched slowly down a hidden stairway, feeling for each new step with his foot. There was another tunnel at the bottom of the stairway, and it seemed even darker than the one he had left, though Duncan didn't suppose that this was actually possible. He heard a scratching noise to his right, and Peasel's triumphant expression was lit by a crackling flame. "Torches!" the pickpocket said proudly, waving a stout stick that dripped flaming tar in alarming amounts. "Made them myself. You never know when the old town guard will raid the place and I might have to make a quick getaway." Duncan sighed. Edinburgh's old town guard were mostly ex-soldiers, well over retirement age. It was unlikely that they would bother raiding a den of vice like the underground city, and they weren't likely to catch more than a cold if they did. In the light of the firebrand, the Highlander could see the stonework in the area was much older and cruder than the tunnels above, and the walls shone with waterlogged moss. The smell was different too, not the stink of stale sweat and smoke that filled most of the chambers, but a wet, earthy smell that reminded Duncan of the caves underneath Highland waterfalls. Peasel moved away again and Duncan followed, touching the walls and sniffing his fingers. "This is no bad, actually," he grinned. "Peaceful, you ken. I can't hear anyone. Why does nobody live down here?" "It's too damp and cold, even for beggars and drunks," Peasel said. "As far as I know, there's only one person staying on this whole level, and that is who we're going to see." "And who might that be?" "His name is Shadow Jack Henry, a blacksmith by trade. He moved down here a couple of months ago. There's a well at the end of this level that's been blocked up for as long as anyone can remember. So Shadow Jack set up a wee forge and opened the well to draw water for it. He makes metal trinkets and sells them to the market traders on the high street. The forge makes the vault warm enough to live in, and there's no one else down here to pay rent to. A nice wee set-up, if you ask me." "Sounds like it," Duncan agreed. "How is it that I've never heard anyone mention him before?" "You know how superstitious ignorant people are," said Peasel, as if he had the benefit of an Oxford education. "There is some old legend about the well being haunted," he continued with a laugh. Something about it leading straight down to hell." Duncan stopped. "Let's go back." Peasel turned in astonishment. What's the matter?" "I'm not going into any haunted place," said Duncan matter-of-factly. "What?" Peasel spluttered. "I thought Highlanders weren't scared of man nor beast. At least that's what you keep telling me about 50 times a day." "Haunted stuff isn't man nor beast." Duncan shook his head. "Haunted stuff is witches and kelpies and the little people. In the Highlands, you didn't mess with creatures like that. Especially the little people." He folded his arms in determination. "I can't believe that you, of all people, would come down here. You that is scared of anything that moves." "I'm scared of camels and volcanoes, but that is scientific stuff," Peasel explained. "This is the 19th century, Duncan. There is no such thing as little people," he sniffed. "Most of the trouble we get is from big people." Duncan shook his head in exasperation, but he was fiercely loyal to his friend, and after a stream of disapproving grunts, he finally indicated to keep going. For a while, the two boys walked without talking, the only sound being Peasel's tatty old boots crunching on loose stones and the rasp of his breathing. The pickpocket had to keep stopping to catch his breath, for a lifetime of sleeping in the underground city and a diet of turnip and salted beef hadn't done much for his health. Duncan didn't try to hurry him, for the wiry Highlander was concerned about his frail friend and wasn't all that keen to get to where they were heading anyway. Unlike Peasel, Duncan moved silently, as he'd learnt to do whilst he was stalking deer. Only now he walked without a sound in case something was creeping up on him. Eventually, a flickering glow appeared at the far end of the tunnel, and they could hear a muffled clanging like a bell, growing louder as they walked. Peasel stopped and gave a long whistle. The ringing stopped. After a few seconds, they heard a similar whistle coming from the direction of the light, and Peasel signalled for Duncan that they could carry on. At the end of the passageway, the boys turned a corner, and a blast of hot, smoke-filled air seared their faces. They stepped from the dark passageway into the bright chamber and came upon a sight that would have confirmed the worst fears of the other underground dwellers. Shadow Jack Henry stood in the middle of a red, shimmering vault, stripped to the waist and swinging a huge hammer. He was so large that he made Merry Andrew look like a midget, and his massive torso, shining with exertion, bore the livid wheels of 100 healed burns. He brought the hammer down on the glowing metal rod that he was shaping, and a shower of dazzling sparks flew into the air, vanishing into the fierce radiance that emanated from the blacksmith's forge. Over the fire, a large metal smelting dish was suspended on a pole between two wooden tripods, powerful flames licking its sooty sides. "My God," whispered Duncan, "we're in the doorway to Hades itself." Shadow Jack looked round. Huge teeth split his bushy black beard as he grinned at the pickpocket. "Peasel, my lad!" He dropped the hammer with a clang, raised his sweaty hand in greeting. The smile vanished as he caught sight of Duncan. "Ah, I see you have brought a visitor." Shadow Jack Henry flexed his considerable muscles, and two bushy eyebrows closed ranks on his sweaty forehead. I don't get many visitors, he said coldly, being a private sort of person. This is Duncan MacPhail, said the pickpocket, pointing to the Highlander. Don't worry, he's a good friend and one that I would trust with my life. That's the type of friend that you want, right enough, said the giant smith, looking at the Highlander up and down before turning back to Peasel. So what have you brought for me, my little man, he said, suddenly brusque and businesslike. The pickpocket pulled a canvas bag from under his shirt and emptied the contents onto the vault floor. 4 snuff boxes glinted in the iridescent light. Shadowjack had knelt down and inspected them. Solid gold and good quality too. They will make a pretty puddle once they're melted done. Well done, lad. He went to a pile of bedding in the corner of the vault and rummaged inside. I will give you 4 shillings for the lot, as I am in an uncommonly generous mood. The blacksmith smiled thinly and folded a few coins into Peasel's hand, his massive fingers enveloping the boys like a shark swallowing a minnow. Shadowjack cast a sideways look at Duncan, just to see if he had any opinion on the price, but the Highlander was staring into the well. It looked harmless enough, just a round hole in the corner of the vault floor with yet another wooden frame and a pulley built over it. A stout rope and a bucket sat nearby. Is this where you draw the water to work your forge? It is, boy, the blacksmith nodded, and there are those who would like nothing better than for me to block that hole up again, but I am far too big to argue with. He motioned with his hand. Don't fall in, though, for I won't venture down to rescue you. Don't worry, we're just going. Peasel was wafting the air in vain, his face already running with sweat. Let's get out of here, Duncan, before I faint dead away with the heat. The Highlander was still trying to peer into the darkness of the well, and Peasel grasped his arm, ushering him quickly out into the vault. Shadowjack didn't bother to say goodbye. He doesn't much like company, especially strangers, the pickpocket said, as the red glow faded away behind them. He showed Duncan the pile of shillings, but I told you we'd eat well tonight. That well back there, Duncan paused. You can hear running water at the bottom. So what? Well in a water doesn't run anywhere. What I heard was a stream. And that means? Peasel looked none the wiser. Thought you were the scientific one, the Highlander scoffed. It means the water down there is coming from somewhere and going somewhere. He patted Peasel on the shoulder. It means that there's another level underneath this one. Charlie sat up with a start, not sure if he'd been dreaming or simply lost in his own thoughts. The sun had gone behind the cloud, and Alan Ramsay's tombstone, wrapped in afternoon shadows, was now cold against his skin. He sat up quickly and closed the journal. Charlie knew exactly where Shadowjack Henry had once worked, for he had been in that very chamber the day before and seen the remains of the blacksmith's forge. He recalled the discarded tripod, the stone circle, the pile of stones he'd removed. Must have been the covering for the well, sealed by some sort of iron plug. And just as well, for hadn't the terrifying drumming noise come from somewhere underneath it? Oh, Charlie shivered again. He didn't like to think the sensation had much to do with the temperature this time. All the same, he looked up to see where the sun had gone, and his shiver turned into a gasp. Floating far above his head was a white hawk with black-tipped wings. Right, I'm going to stop there. I want you to clean your teeth. I want you to wash your hands. Get yourselves into your bed. Give yourself a great big huge cuddle, because you'll deserve it. And hopefully I'll see you again tomorrow night. Night-night. Well, hello there. My name is Sarah, and I am reading a ghost story called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. We're now up to chapter 7, The Dungeons. Charlie hurried back to the guest house, his mind in a whirl. Like the last time he'd opened Peasel's diary, the boy was not sure if he'd imagined or actually witnessed the events in the past. But there was no doubt that he had actually seen a hawk, right here and now, identical to the one that Duncan described 2 centuries ago. Perhaps the bird's descendants still nested in the same area, and by some genetic fluke, some bore the same markings. Then again, maybe all hawks around here were white with black-tipped wings. Duncan didn't seem to know much about the lowland wildlife of Scotland, and neither did Charlie. Anyway, the boy had more pressing questions. How had Shadow Jack Henry's well come to be blocked up, hidden under a pile of rocks along with Peasel's book? What was the mysterious rapping that he'd heard in the underground city, and what exactly happened to the boys from the past? By the time Charlie reached the guest house, his parents had left for their nightly performances at the Big Top. A little tray of biscuits and tea bags were provided in each room, so the boy grabbed a handful of chocolate digestives, opened the journal, and lay down on the bed to read. The next Sunday, we arranged to meet in the afternoon once more, as Duncan had gone calling on his lady friend again, and he seems to be creature of habit. I was bored waiting, and knowing that the castle esplanade was filled with gentlemen taking the air, I vowed to lighten a few of their back pockets before returning to see my friend. Edinburgh Castle was on the highest pinnacle of the Old Town Ridge. The muddy road that led up to it was steep and slippy, and Peasel was wheezing like a donkey long before he reached the top. Eventually the slope opened onto the castle esplanade, an exposed area leading to the huge iron portcullis that fronted the massive fortress walls. Since the other three sides of the castle overlooked sheer cliff faces, the esplanade was the only real way to reach the castle, which left potential invaders horribly exposed. It was said that an approach was exactly the length and that an arrow could be accurately fired. In peacetime, however, the esplanade's tremendous height made it the perfect spot for sightseeing, and now the area was filled with young men trying to impress their lady friends by wearing their Sunday best and pretending to know the names of the far-off hills. Peasel strolled around like the city's scruffiest tourist, secretly eyeing young men buying cups of flavoured ice for their paramours and watching where they kept their purses. A fool and his money are soon parted, and love makes a fool of the wisest men, the pickpocket said sagely. I must write that down. While Peasel was spying on potential victims, Duncan sat at the bottom of Blair Street, listening to Gypsy Girl as she sang to the crowds. Like so many of the old town's narrow winds, Blair Street sloped steeply down from the high street until it vanished into the slums of the Cowgate at the bottom. Each wind had its own distinct character, and this particular thoroughfare was lined with bookstalls and filled with what Peasel always referred to as learned gents browsing idly amongst the leather-bound volumes. Near the bottom of the wind, the stalls thinned out, and there were gents paused to listen to the Gypsy Girl, for she had a voice that seemed to make the words sweeter than any book could. This time, however, her tune was making Duncan melancholy, a lament about the clans forced to leave their homeland after the doomed Highland Revolt of 1745. Even the girl's name reminded him of the Highlands, Heather. Halfway through her refrain, Heather noticed Duncan's expression and broke off in mid-tune. She picked up a few grubby coins, and to the disappointment of the gathered gents, she came and sat beside him, her thick black hair swinging across her face as she lowered herself down. "Is my singing making you sad?" she said, looking sideways at him. "The song is," he replied, "and all the more for being sung so beautifully." "If you miss the Highlands so much, why did you leave?" Heather asked. "If I might be so bold," she added quickly, for she knew that the Highlander wasn't one to reveal his feelings casually. But Duncan answered without any prompting, for the song had also reminded him of a great injustice, and he felt that injustices should always be brought into the open. "The land my clan had worked for generations was taken from them, so the laird could use it for his sheep to graze," he said, with an undisguised disgust. "There was nae work any more for the men who lived there." "I'm sorry," said Heather, but Duncan hadn't finished. "An outbreak of cholera 5 years ago killed many, my own father included. The rest of the clan booked passages to North Carolina to start a new life in the Americas." Hyland's face was expressionless. "My mother wouldn't go." "Why not?" There was a long silence before the boy spoke again. "I had a brother, little more than an infant. Ma used to leave him in the doorway of our croft, wrapped in a wee tartan shawl while she picked wild berries. I was supposed to be watching him. I looked away for only a few seconds, I swear." He kept his head bowed, but the gypsy could hear his pain, cracking his voice. When I turned back, he was gone. Heather covered her mouth with her hands. I thought it must be a wolf or a starving dog that took him, but I searched the moorlands for days. It's no use. Duncan's voice had suddenly grown hard and flat. Ma would not accept that. She said my brother had been taken by the little people. The fairy folk. Heather nodded, unsurprised. In those days, people still believed in such creatures. Aye. My mother died herself of the cholera some months after, but until that time, she stood in the doorway every night at dusk and called my brother's name, hoping the little people might take pity on her and bring him back. He looked up and smiled forlornly. They never did. Pretending to stare at the view, Peasel stretched out his hand and slowly lifted the tailcoat of the young man to his left, who was chatting animatedly to his lady. A stiff breeze blew from the Pentland Hills across the esplanade and tore at the youth's clothes, making the pickpocket's practice manoeuvre almost impossible to detect. The wallet slid out of the back pocket, vanished into Peasel's vest, and the pickpocket gave a satisfied smile. The young man was so engrossed in his bell that Peasel could have stolen his underwear. As the boy turned to escape, the grin froze on his lips. 2 kilted soldiers stood behind him, pointing their bayonets at his stomach. Heather sat silently beside Duncan, and for a while she allowed the Highlander his own thoughts. Eventually, however, she spoke again. Do you think the little people took your brother? Dinna ken, Highlander sighed. At our clan gatherings, the old men used to scare us with stories about them. It was the same with us gypsies, Heather agreed. According to our elders, the little people have many names. Elves, fairies, sprites, imps, pixies, brownies. Our legends say that they all used to live all over the world. But as the men began to spread across the globe, so the little people returned to their homeland of Galhadria. The girl lowered her voice, as if some unseeing being might be listening. They said that in the quiet places of the earth, the Galhadrians sometimes return to dance or hunt, and it's a great misfortune for any man to come upon them. Duncan was familiar with this part of the story. Children in the Highlands had long been warned of thin places, remote valleys and hilltops where the barrier between this world and the domain of the little people were closest. Though he had never heard the name Galhadria before, in these thin places, you might accidentally stumble on the little people dancing in the moonlight, and if you did, they would take you to their world against your wish. It wasn't that the little people were evil. The old ones of the clan would say it was just that the wishes of men didn't mean that much to them. Duncan supposed that that was why they could take a human baby without worrying what it might do to a mother or a brother. We were told that the little people sometimes take our children and leave one of their own in its place, he said. And you can't tell if it's really one of the fairy folk until it grows up. Or sometimes they leave a horribly deformed changeling, or they didn't leave anything at all. I wish I knew what was true. He looked around at Heather. What's the matter? The gypsy girl was looking at the ground, her fists clenched. Nothing, she answered quietly. I just think that legends can get mixed up over time. Even a small mix-up can change the meaning of everything. Heather paused, as if she had more to say, but before Duncan could press her, she scrambled to her feet. I'd better give them another song, something more cheerful. She smiled and nodded towards another group of wealthy gentlemen milling around the nearest bookstall. She began to sing again, and the men gathered around and reached into their pockets. Peasel had never been inside the castle before, and though he was truly impressed by the lofty battlements and the smoke-blackened towers, he wished at this moment that he could be anywhere else on the planet. The 2 soldiers marched him up the winding cobbled road into the very heart of the fortifications, past endless stone barracks, cannons and cooking fires. The castle hadn't seen a battle for half a century, but it was still a military garrison, and kilted recruits and officers in bright tartan trews and scarlet jackets stared as the pickpocket was escorted past. The air pulsed with the smell of roasting meat and the sound of shouted orders. What are you going to do to me? He asked one of the soldiers timidly. If it were up to me, lad, I'd possibly just shoot you, he replied with a thick brogue. But it's to the dungeons I'm taking you. The dungeons? Peasel squealed and quickly regained his composure. Panicking wasn't going to help this situation. I thought they were only for prisoners of war. They are, the soldier replied. But we're not at war with anyone at present, and as it happens, there's a couple of men down there from the town council, so I reckon I'll just hand yous over to them. He motioned with his bayonet towards an oak doorway set in a tower wall, and the other soldier pushed Peasel through. Behind the door, a steep staircase wound into the bowels of the castle, and the soldiers' tickety boots clattered on the stone as they followed Peasel round and down, past cold, gaping chambers fortified with iron bars. In the darkness, some of the vaults, Peasel could hear murmuring in some language he didn't understand. Dutch smugglers, said the talkative man. Can't understand a bloody word they're saying. The trio eventually arrived at the long corridor lit by thick, acrid candles. A group of men, 2 soldiers, 2 civilians, were clustered around a table, cluttered with paper, trying to read in the flickering light. Shh! The total doesn't show up on any of these charts we have. A soldier with a giant walrus moustache barked. The civilians gave a little jump. There's no telling where it might lead. Might be a few feet or it might lead right under our defences. Yes, Sergeant, the other soldier, an officer of some sort, folded his hand behind his back. We simply have to find out where it goes. Can't fit any of our men in there, you say? No, sir. Civilians winced again. Not even Private Hemingway, and he lost his legs at Waterloo. The sergeant thought for a second before adding, and an arm. The officer sighed. The sergeant turned to Peasel and his guards. What are you doing with that boy, Private McSorry? Caught him stealing, sir. Wallets. Up on the esplanade. That's not a military matter, Private, said the officer brusquely. I know, sir. And I thought since there were 2 members of the town council here, I'd bring him to him. The councillors, dressed in identical breeches and frock coats, looked up from the charts. It's not our concern, soldier, said one. Deliver him to the town guards. He'll most likely be tried by the magistrate on Monday. The officer stroked his moustache thoughtfully before speaking. What will happen to the boy? It's a serious charge, pickpocketing, if he was caught red-handed. The councillor went back to studying the charts. He'll be deported to a penal colony in Australia, like as not. Peasel raised his hand. Actually, I was just testing these fine soldiers' power of observation, and very alert they were too. I was going to put the money back. Don't even bother, lad. The officer crouched down beside Peasel and put a hand on his shoulder. But there might be a way we could forget this whole incident. Oh, I don't think that's possible, the councillor looked up again. Boy broke the law. What I'm proposing, lad, the officer ignored the interruption, is for you to redeem yourself by a bit bravery. Like a little soldier, eh? Peasel nodded enthusiastically. Not having a clue what the officer was talking about, encouraged, the man continued. We have found a tunnel in the dungeons, lad. Didn't even know it was there, and we need to know where it goes. But it's too small for any of my men to fit in, see? Peasel nodded again, more slowly this time. He was beginning to understand what the officer was getting at. So, if you was to have a little explore of this tunnel and tell us where it went, the army would consider it an act of patriotism, a great civic duty. Isn't that right, gentlemen? Now the councillors were nodding as well. Private McSorry gave Peasel a thumbs-up sign. True, a boy would be forgiven a bit of thievery if he was as patriotic as that, one councillor said slyly. Wouldn't get sent to Australia, neither. Peasel looked from one looming adult to another. They leant towards him, moustaches bristling. All right, said the pickpocket wearily. Show me the tunnel. Wait a minute, how will we know where he's gone? The other councillor spoke. Drum, sir! Screamed the sergeant, and the councillors jumped again. There's a tiny drum in the officer's mess. It was made for Colonel Grouper's little boy before he blew his head off playing with a loaded musket. All right, sergeant, fetch the drum and the firebrand for the lad. The officer leant forward towards Peasel. We're going to make a hero out of you, son, rather than a villain, he whispered, not unkindly. Charlie sat up in bed, covered in sweat. He was still fully dressed, but his mother must have removed his shoes, put a cover over him when she'd come home. The curtains were open, and he could see the moon shining behind the spires of Edinburgh. Oh, my God. The legend, he whispered to himself, remembering the rapping that he'd heard in the underground city. Peasel is the little drummer boy. Wow. Now, I didn't see that coming. Did you? I hope that you've cleaned your teeth, washed your hands, and snuggling up into bed and give yourself a great big huge cuddle because you deserve it. And I will hopefully see you tomorrow for the next chapter. Night-night. Hello, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading a ghost story called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is chapter 8, The Descent. Charlie felt as if he'd slept for hours, even though it was still dark. Perhaps he had, for now he was wide awake and itching to get up and do something. He put on his shoes, stuffed the diary inside his shirt, and went to the window. The old town was hunched in the middle of Edinburgh like a sleeping dragon, a heavy moon gilding its jagged outline. Charlie looked at his watch. It's 4:30 in the morning. He unlatched the window and stuck his head out. There was a drain pipe a couple of feet to the left, but his room was on the second floor, and it was too dark to tell whether the garden below was grass, soil, or paving. Yet suddenly he wanted to know. In fact, he wanted to know everything, and not just know everything, but feel everything too. For it was the closest he would come to describing it. For the first time, Charlie Wilson really wanted to be part of the adventure, rather than just a spectator. Almost without thinking, he pulled himself onto the broad window ledge and twisted round to grasp the drain pipe in both hands. He had never actually watched his parents practice their high wire act, but he remembered how they moved in the routines that he'd seen. And he recalled his father saying that hesitation was an acrobat's worst enemy. With a deep breath, Charlie swung one foot over the pipe and planted it against the wall, took his other foot off the windowsill and began to climb down, hand over hand. A minute later he was standing on the dark, dewy grass, not even out of breath. This was better than a video game, he said brightly, letting himself out of the garden gate and heading towards the old town. Edinburgh Festival's events went on until around 1 in the morning, and the pubs closed even later. But at this hour, even the most hardened partygoers had gone to bed, and the streets were deserted as Charlie made his way up the high street and onto the castle esplanade. Far below, the lights of Edinburgh glittered like a swarm of fireflies, but the castle was a soaring block of darkness, casting a net of shadows over the esplanade and turning monuments and trees into sinister blobs. Charlie felt as though he was standing on another world. Then the first rays of dawn began to filter through the tall tenements on the Royal Mile, spotting the castle ramparts with light and laying golden strips along the esplanade. They lit a low bordering wall, and Charlie went and sat on the ground with his back against it. As the minutes ticked by, the castle slowly turned from black to charcoal to grey, and then the boy could make out the outlines of statues, railings and ticket booths. Eventually, it was light enough to read, and he opened Peasel's diary. The tunnel was at the back of the darkest, deepest dungeon, and there was hardly room for even a boy of a small size to fit inside. I held the firebrand in front of me with one hand and dragged the drum behind me on a leather strap tied to my waist. The officer had instructed me to stop every few minutes or so and bang the drum as loudly as I could, so that he could hear where I was going, but this proved to be more difficult than he imagined. The firebrand spluttered badly, and the narrowness of the tunnel deflected the heat back into Peasel's face. He was forced to hold the torch as far in front of him as he could and crawl using his free arm. The leather strap attached to the drum kept getting tangled in his legs, and the only way that he could make a noise was to stop crawling and kick at the drum's taut skin with his foot. The councilmen and the soldiers at the entrance of the tunnel waited until the erratic banging was so faint that they could hardly hear it. "Sergeant," the officer said finally, "take some men and scour the main courtyard. See if they can pick up the noise and put some out on the esplanades too." "Yes, sir!" The sergeant stooped attention, then hesitated. "Begging your pardon, sir, but that drum the lad's dragging behind him fills the entire tunnel. If it comes to a dead end, how's he going to get back?" This is a military garrison," the officer gave the sergeant a withering look. We can't just have tunnels running who knows where. We need to know where it goes. So he turned and he walked away. Wriggling along the tiny passageway, Peasel was soon close to exhaustion. The firebrand in front of him was burning precious oxygen. What air he could suck into his straining lungs was hot and thin, and his elbows and his knees throbbed where the rough stone had torn away at his skin. Worst of all, he was gripped by a rising panic that was becoming harder and harder to quell. He wanted to scream in rage and fear and thrash at the walls, but he knew that this would use up even more air. Instead, he forced himself to lie still until he felt a semblance of calm return. Then he began to crawl forward once more. Finally, when the pickpocket had almost given up hope, the little passage began to widen. Soon Peasel could crawl on his hands and knees, then managed a crouching shuffle, and then, finally, he was able to stand. He put the torch on the ground, fastened the drum properly around his waist, untied the drumstick strapped to his thigh. On the castle esplanade, Private McSorry sat on a low wall, smoking a pipe. "McSorry!" roared the sergeant. "I know the boy's probably dead already, or the extremities are being eaten by rats, but that doesn't mean you can give up looking." He stopped suddenly and held up a large scarred hand. "What's that?" "What's what?" "Silence, you horrible little man!" the sergeant screamed. "How am I supposed to concentrate with you whittering on?" He dropped to his knees, pressed a hairy ear to the ground. "That's drumming, Private, that's what it is, under the ground." He looked up, moustache quivering, beckoned to the officer. "Sir, over here!" Peasel marched along the tunnel, firebrand raised high. Occasionally he stopped and beat the drum for a few seconds, but not very often, for the sound was deafening in such an enclosed space. The boy was wary of making a loud noise at the best of times, for pickpockets, out of sheer habit, didn't like to attract unwanted attention. But who knew what was lurking in the passageways? However alarming the drumming was, Peasel was far more disconcerted by the fact that the tunnel had begun to slope steeply down. Now, with every turn, he was moving deeper into the bowels of the earth. Then he came to a door. It was ancient and thick, its misshapen oak timbers covered in dark mould. Peasel groaned in disbelief. What on God's green earth is this doing here? Must be a ton, and I'll wager its hinges are rusted solid with age. He gave it a half-hearted shove at the giant oak. I bet Goliath himself couldn't shift it. The door swung open without a sound, and Peasel fell through into another passage. The barrier shut again, and the pickpocket sprang to his feet, swiping wildly in the air with his drumsticks and screaming, but no hidden monster appeared. And this tunnel looked the same as it did on the other side of the door. Regaining his composure, Peasel turned and inspected the barrier more closely. The torch lit up the hinges, ornate, finely crafted, and looked as if they had been made yesterday. No wonder they didn't rust, the pickpocket breathed. If I'm not mistaken, they're solid silver, finer than any snuff box I've ever seen. He ran his torch excitedly over the rest of the door and found that its surface was pitted with metal studs, glowing with a flickering beauty, and they too were silver. Peasel grabbed a narrow rock and tried with all his strength to prise one off, but the stud stayed put. Damn! The pickpocket finally gave up. Don't suppose there's much chance of stumbling on a crowbar. He stepped back and studied the door with a growing suspicion. Why anyone would go to the trouble of building such an ornate barricade way down here, then making it so easy to get through? His eyes widened, unless it only opens from one side. The pickpocket launched himself at the door and pushed with all his might. Didn't budge. He tried pulling on the silver studs, but his hands just slipped off. "Blast, blast, blast!" he sobbed, and attacked the door again, but he already knew in his heart that it was useless. He gave the unyielding wood one last kick, picked up the firebrand, and continued, still cursing, down the tunnel. But the unpleasant surprises weren't over, for before long the tunnel forked. Peasel stopped and stared at the identical passageways. "Oh, both of these probably lead to certain death, so it doesn't matter which one I take," he muttered, and he went left. But after a while the tunnel split again, and then again, and every few minutes he had to make a fresh choice. Peasel tried to pick the passages that didn't slope too much, but each corridor twisted and turned and led downwards. Desperation eventually overcame fear, and as the boy marched, he began to beat the drum, berating himself with each stroke for agreeing to this insanity. He would probably keep descending until he died from thirst or reached Australia after all. Then he turned a corner and stopped dead. Once again, the passageway split in different directions, but this time the left-hand passage opened into a large chamber. It seemed to have suffered a rockfall. On one side of the vault's boulders, there rose a steep angle from the floor almost to the roof. The pickpocket's mouth fell open and the drumsticks fell unnoticed from his hands. Scattering across the sloping hill of stones was a mass of breastplates and helmets, while swords, spears and arrows protruded from between the large rocks. They glowed coldly in the firebrand's light, and Peasel could tell at a glance that the weapons and the armour, like the door studs, were made of solid silver. The pickpocket was looking at more wealth than he could ever have imagined, and he could imagine a lot of wealth. He clambered onto the rockfall and ran trembling hands over the shiny surfaces. "This is the best thing that has ever happened to me," he sighed, laying his cheek reverently on a gleaming breastplate. "Now I really do have to get out of here alive." He cast an expert eye over the treasure until he spotted what he was sure was the finest piece. Near the ceiling, a beautifully engraved sword with a jewel-encrusted handle was wedged between two boulders. The pickpocket scrambled to the top, grasped the handle, and pulled with all his might. The sword slid out of the narrow gap, astonishingly light in his hand, and smouldering with a steely blush that seemed to come from within. "This one will do nicely." Peasel climbed back down the rock pile, the drum banging awkwardly against his knees. With a grunt, he unfastened a clasp on the leather strap, and the drum crashed to the ground and rolled off down the tunnel. Peasel fastened the sword in its place, picked up the firebrand, and set off down the open passage, whistling to himself. Now that he was carrying a weapon worth a fortune, the pickpocket was filled with a newfound enthusiasm. Halfway down the Royal Mile, the sergeant took his ear from the ground and slowly stood up. On one side of his head, matted with mud, it was sticking out like a small explosion. The councillors and the officer looked at him expectantly. The drumming kept getting fainter, sir, like the boy was getting further and further underground." The sergeant took a deep breath, and then it stopped. There was silence for a few seconds before the officer turned to the councillors. "Doubt very much if we have found an escape tunnel or a secret entrance to the castle, if it just goes down that far." He turned to the sergeant. "Just to be on the safe side, order the men back to the dungeons and have them seal the passage up again." Begging pardon, sir." The sergeant looked flustered, for he was not used to questioning his superiors. "Just because the drum stopped doesn't mean the boy's dead." "No, indeed, sergeant." The officer tapped an ivory-topped cane angrily against his leg. "But my priority is the defence of the castle, not the fate of some thief." He quickly turned his back, indicating that their brief conversation was over. "Hiya, sir!" The sergeant motioned to McSorry and his companions to follow and marched purposely back up the high street. He'd seen children die before. The drummer boy of his own regiment had been swept away in a French cannon blast at the Battle of Osterstad. He didn't approve, of course, but orders were orders. Charlie opened his eyes. The whole of the esplanade was bathed in the early morning sunlight, and the brass statues that lined the sides were shining like precious metal. "Breastplates and helmets and swords," the boy breathed softly, "all solid silver and encrusted with jewels." He remembered Lily's words when he'd first shown her the note. "I bet it means there's treasure hidden down there." "Phew, you said it, girl," laughed Charlie, shutting the diary. Then a laugh died in his throat as he recalled what she had said next. What if those council workers are heading towards it? Charlie sprang to his feet and raced down the high street towards the big top. "Oh, but good grief! I hope Peasel's going to be okay. 200 years ago. Anyway, I hope that you have been washing your hands, cleaning your teeth, and now you're snuggled up in your bed to give yourself a great big huge cuddle, because you deserve it. Night-night, and I will see you tomorrow. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, a ghost story set in Edinburgh. We're up to chapter 9, The Forge. Charlie half expected to see Lily juggling elephants, or something equally bizarre, when he burst into the theatre, but she was sitting on the floor in her usual green dress, drinking a can of Coke. Charlie's face was red and sweating after running halfway down the Royal Mile, so Lily held out the drink to him and he took a huge gulp. Bubbles shot out of his nose. Oh, charming. Listen, the boy spluttered after 3 minutes of uncontrollable hiccuping. There really is treasure in the underground city, in a set of blocked-up tunnels. It's in Peasel's journal. Oh, sorry. He handed the can, overflowing with froth, back to Lily, who looked at it in disgust. There's silver, lots of it, according to the book. Told you. Lily allowed herself a triumphant little smile. Yeah, but we're in trouble. There's council workers excavating down there. You said so yourself. Charlie pointed to the back of the big top. We need to get underground and find that treasure before they do. We? I thought I was just a lookout. I don't know about you, said Charlie hotly, but that treasure would mean an awful lot to me. You've never seen where I live. It's small and it's cheap because my parents hardly make any money. If you hadn't noticed, there isn't exactly a lot of work at a job centre for acrobats. Hey! Lily held up a hand. Calm down. Take a seat. She pulled Charlie down beside her and he sat, chest heaving, trying to get his emotions as well as his breathing under control. For a start, you don't know if the council workers are digging anywhere near the treasure. But they might be, Charlie interrupted, running his hand through his hair. They might reach it any day. Yes, but you don't know that. Lily took the boy's hand and stared earnestly into his face, her green eyes somehow soothing him. Charlie, we don't even know if the treasure is still there. The boy began to shake his head, but she squeezed his hand tighter. The diary is almost 200 years old, remember? He nodded sullenly. You need to read the rest of the book before you go running back into those tunnels. She gave one more last squeeze before letting go of his hand. You need to find out exactly what's down there. Oh, yeah, you're right. Charlie stood up and went to the ranks of chairs where the audience normally sat. He plonked himself down and pulled out the diary. What are you doing? Taking your advice. He looked up. I'm going to finish the diary. Go ahead, juggle if you want. He went back to the book and began reading. Lily pulled several multicoloured balls from the pockets and began to toss them in the air, her hands moving faster and faster until there were no more than a pink smear. After a while, the balls were joined by glittering stars, circling around each other like a tiny galaxy. One of the balls burst into flames without interrupting its mad spinning. Charlie didn't look up. Lily sighed. The balls began to vanish one by one, their motions got slower, and the stars glittered less brightly and went out. Finally, only the flaming ball spun uncertainly on the end of the girl's finger. With a flick of her wrist, her hand enveloped the flames, snuffing it out, and the ball dropped, smoking, to the floor. Lily walked over to Charlie. Oh, budge up then, she said, sitting next to him. Let's have a look. The tunnel seemed to be levelling out at last, but I was no longer scared of meeting any monsters, or not very much, for I had my magnificent sword, which I intended to sell as soon as I could find my way to the surface. Uh-oh. Peasel looked up at his spluttering torch. The shadows in the tunnel were becoming thicker and darker as the firebrand's flame grew lower. The pickpocket increased his pace, but he couldn't go much faster, for the extent of his ill health was making itself painfully obvious. The boy had a nagging stitch in his side and his breath was coming in ragged gasps. And the reduced light meant that he stumbled on the uneven floor every few feet, sometimes sprawling head first across the pitted floor. On the fourth or the fifth fall, he lay exhausted, while the firebrand's flame faded to smoky embers and the tunnel melted into a terrifying blackness. Still lying on the floor, Peasel curled himself into a ball and began to cry. Gradually his crying turned to a shivering whimper, for the tunnel was cold and the heat that Peasel had worked up during his early exertions was evaporating. He closed his eyes, pulled his elbows and his knees in tighter, trying to shut out the cold and the darkness and the fear, but lay perfectly still. Had made him aware of something that he hadn't noticed before. He could hear a faint, sinister hiss somewhere up ahead. A snake! Peasel's eyes shot open. His hand went to the hilt of his sword. He drew the weapon slowly from his leather belt and held it protectively in front of his face. To his astonishment, the sword glowed with a pale blue luminance. Not as effective as the firebrand, but enough to let him see the few feet of the passage ahead. Peasel knew that lying down nothing, no matter how scared he felt, wasn't going to help solve his predicament. And something was making that hiss. Of course, it might be a giant underground snake, but then again, it might just be the wind blowing in from somewhere outside. There was only one way to find out, so he struggled to his feet and he started forwards, jabbing the sword aggressively before him. Whenever the tunnel branched, Peasel listened carefully, then went in the direction of the noise. And he knew he was choosing well, for at each fork the sound got louder, though never as loud as the pounding of his heart. Then the passage ended, and Peasel found himself looking into a small volcanic chamber, triangular in shape, not much higher than his head. At the narrow end of it, a stream emerged from a rock fissure and rolled sluggishly through a gash in the floor, eroded by centuries of flowing water. At the wider end, it vanished into a darkness again. Peasel gripped his sword hand tighter, for the surface of the stream danced and sparkled with a strange red light that made the water look suspiciously like blood. The pickpocket had once overheard a conversation between two learned gents about Greek mythology, whatever that was. They recounted a story about how dead souls were ferried down an underground river and into hell, which was guarded by a three-headed hound called Cerberus. The pickpocket looked around in terror. "Nice doggy," he hissed and sank to his knees, clasping his hands in front of his face. Please, get me out of this." He closed his eyes, praying to whatever deity happened to be listening. "I have always wanted to die rich, but not 10 minutes after I got rich." He opened one eye and he looked pleadingly upwards. "Come on, I will do anything. Just give me a sign." An object came hurtling out of the blackness above and plunged into the stream. Showering the pickpocket with icy needles of water, he scuttled back against the chamber wall, gasping with cold and fear and waving his sword ineffectively at the general direction of the unknown attacker. The water broke again, and a wooden bucket tied to the end of a rope emerged full and dripping from the watercourse. It rose jerkily back up and vanished into a red glowing hole in the chamber wall. "Whoa, hey! Whoever's up there!" the pickpocket screamed at the top of his voice. "I'm down here! Here! Oh, damn!" He still held the silver sword. He looked round in panic and spotted a large boulder, ran over and pushed the sword into the shadows behind it. He whirled back, took a deep breath, jumped into the icy stream and waded to the centre of the chamber. Above him, he could now see a long, thin funnel, rising 40 feet through the solid rock of the chamber roof and ending in a circle of red light. Suddenly, he knew exactly where he was. "Shadow Jack! Shadow Jack Henry, I'm down here!" The pickpocket yelled up the funnel. "I'm down here!" He waved his arms maniacally, though nobody above could possibly see him. "I'm at the bottom of your well!" A bearded face appeared in the red circle above. "Peasel, is that you?" Shadow Jack's voice echoed down the shaft. "How the hell did you get down there?" The rope and bucket came hurtling down again. Shivering and crying, Peasel sat on the bucket, arms and legs wrapped around the sodden rope, and Shadow Jack Henry pulled him to safety. A few minutes later, Peasel was sitting in Shadow Jack's vault, wrapped in a woolen blanket and sipping a cup of hot ale. A pot of the sweet-smelling brew bubbled on the forge, and the pickpocket's clothes hung steaming on the bar above. Shadow Jack sat next to the boy, stripped to the waist, holding his own mug in a giant scarred hand. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, while Peasel told him about his underground journey. The pickpocket missed out the part about the treasure. He wasn't about to trust such a big man with so much wealth at stake. "That's a fine adventure, without a doubt," he said when Peasel had finished. The two stared at each other for a long time, until the blacksmith spoke again. "If you go back to the surface, they'll probably just arrest you." Peasel nodded bitterly. "No, I don't think I would be much of a friend if I let you go back to the surface." Shadow Jack stroked his beard slowly, still looking keenly at the boy. The pickpocket couldn't see much friendliness in that stare. They sat in silence for a while longer. Shadow Jack still stared intently. Finally, Peasel couldn't stand it any more. "You know about the treasure, don't you?" he said bluntly. "Aye, I do," Shadow Jack admitted. "You think anything but treasure would keep me in this hellhole? I've not seen a bloody tree in 3 months." The giant stretched a burly arm over the forge, and shifting Peasel's clothes so that they wouldn't scorch, he took another gulp of his ale. "I was a fine smith, you know," he said, after a long pause, "working out by Kelty, across the River Forth. I did all right when we were fighting Napoleon and the army needed cannon and cartwheels like, but after the war, many of the harvested the land left for the cities, for they have machines now that can do their work." Shadow Jack spat on the floor to show what he thought of mechanised farming. Me, I couldn't work in some hot, sweaty, cramped factory. Peasel looked incredulously around the sweltering little vault. "How on earth did you end up down here?" "I went to Leith Docks to enlist in the King's Navy. I got to quite like the cannon. Thought I might make a good cabin boy." Peasel frowned. He could never tell if Shadow Jack was joking or just slightly insane. The big man carried on with his tale of woe regardless. "I was having a last whisky or 3 in one of the taverns when I overheard 2 gypsy types talking in a corner. A mite the worst for the grog that they were, and a bit louder than they were intending to be. I only caught the end of what they were saying, but it sounded powerful interesting to me. Another ale?" "No, thanks." Shadow Jack poured more steaming liquid into the boy's cup anyway. One was telling the other some old gypsy legend about how there was supposed to be treasure hidden in a well under Edinburgh. Shadow Jack took another large swig of his ale. In fact, it was still boiling, and that didn't seem to bother him. And he'd heard from a beggar that there happened to be a blocked-up well at the bottom of the underground city. "So you decided to abandon a life on the ocean wave and move here?" Peasel looked sceptical. "Well, to be honest, I can't swim." The blacksmith took a deep breath. "Besides, the only ship in port was a barge carrying treacle to Glasgow. So I came down here, built a forge and opened up the well." He pointed to the forbidding hole in the corner of the vault. "Late at night, I'd climb down the shaft and search for the treasure. Took me a while to find it. Not as fast as you, eh?" "Yeah, I was born lucky," Peasel snorted. Then he had a thought. "How are you going to get all that treasure out without anybody spotting it?" "Simple. Melting it down in the forge." "You're what?" Instead of replying, Shadow Jack padded over to the darkest corner of the vault and picked up a large knife. Peasel clutched his mug tighter, but the blacksmith pulled a horseshoe from his pocket, scraping at it with the blade, and he held it out. Under the dirty iron surface, the metal gleamed brightly. Peasel drew in breath sharply. "Throw a bit of dirt on it when it's hot, and a silver horseshoe will look as drab and worthless as any iron one. When I've turned all the treasure into those horseshoes, I'll pile them in a cart, and I'll ride out of Edinburgh a rich man. Your outfit's dry." Warily, Peasel took the stiff, warm clothes and began to put them on. Shadow Jack stood up and stretched. The movement put him between the pickpocket and the vault door, and his shadow rose menacingly up the wall and flickered across the roof. He was still holding the knife. "There is only one flaw in my plan," He looked darkly at the boy. Peasel shrank back from the bushy gaze. If anyone told on me, I'd find myself fighting off every thief and beggar in the city. I wouldn't tell, said Peasel in a small voice. Not ever. I want to believe that, lad, said Shadowjack, taking a step forward. Peasel saw that the giant was sweating more than he ever had, working on his forge. The knife was still in his hand, reflecting the blood-red glow of the fire. I like you, boy, but that's an awful lot of treasure down there. Peasel began to walk away as Shadowjack advanced. His mind was working furiously. You're right. That is an awful lot of treasure, he said to his horror that the blacksmith was herding him towards the mouth of the well. It can't be easy melting it down on your own. True. Shadowjack shifted the knife from one hand to the other, still moving towards the boy. I don't like to leave the vault for more than a few minutes in case someone stumbles on my little operation, and that makes the job slow going. How many horseshoes have you made in a month? 3. Okay, I take your point. Peasel was on the edge of the well mouth now. He could hear the gurgle of the water below and feel cold air rising at the back. What if you had help? He said quickly. You could be finished before you knew it. Shadowjack stopped and raised a thick black eyebrow. Help? Suppose I was to go down the well and bring out the silver for you to smelt down. My friend Duncan could be the lookout. He's from the Highland. Nobody can sneak up on him unawares, and he's handy with a sword if he did. Peasel struggled to keep the fear out of his voice and to sound as reasonable and businesslike as possible. Shadowjack, there is enough silver down there to make all 3 of us rich a dozen times over. The blacksmith tapped the knife against his cheek while Peasel teetered on the edge of the well. All right, lad, he said suddenly. You have a deal. He shot out a meaty paw and grasped Peasel's hand. The force of his handshake lifted the boy away from the menacing hole, and he bounced around on the end of the blacksmith's arm like a rag doll. Shadowjack, he said through rattling teeth, why didn't those gypsies come looking for the treasure themselves? The shaking stopped. I don't know, lad, the giant blacksmith said evenly. Leith is a rough area. Maybe something unfortunate happened to them. He let go of the pickpocket's hand and gave a toothy grin. Off you go, find your pal, come right back. Don't ask any more daft questions. Peasel went, still shaking like a leaf. I don't know if I really trust Shadowjack, do you? Anyway, clean your teeth, keep washing your hands because it is so important. Snuggle into your bed, give yourself a lovely big cuddle because you're worth it. And hopefully I'll see you tomorrow for the next chapter. Night-night. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading a ghost story set in Edinburgh. It's called Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, and we're up to chapter 10. The Galhadrian Wrath. Charlie shut Peasel's diary with a snap. Well, that's that, isn't it? He snorted. They took the treasure and buggered off out of Edinburgh. I might have known we wouldn't be lucky enough to still find it down there. Don't be so sure. Lily tapped the dirty old book. If those guys rose into the sunset with silver, then why was Peasel's diary still in the underground city? Charlie arched an eyebrow. If I had that much money, a stupid diary would be the last thing on my mind. Even if it implicated you to stealing a fortune? Never thought of that. Charlie pointed an appreciative finger at Lily and opened Peasel's diary again. Duncan, Shadowjack and myself began removing the silver. I would take a piece of armour or sword, carry it to the bottom of the well and put it in the bucket, and Shadowjack would haul it up, melt it down and beat it into a horseshoe shape. Duncan kept a lookout and fetched food and water, and by this method, working day and night, we quickly transformed all the silver until there were only a few pieces left. Duncan sat on a pile of rags in the doorway of the vault where he and Peasel lived. The chamber was one of the last in this particular tunnel and an ideal place to keep watch to see if anyone walked past. Heading for the hidden staircase, the Highlander didn't know why he was bothering. In the week they'd both been working, Not one person had shown the slightest interest in going in the direction of the blacksmith's vault. The combination of superstition and the undetectable fear of an antisocial giant like Shadowjack Henry had effectively dampened the curiosity of the underground city dwellers. Even the likes of Merry Andrew stayed away. Today was the last day of their enterprise. The armour and weapons were almost all gone, and a huge pile of dirt-covered horseshoes were now piled in the corner of Shadowjack's chamber. The blacksmith had used all his savings to purchase a horse and cart, which was now tethered in stables at the Pleasance, a few hundred yards away. At dusk, the trio would transport the booty to the surface, load it onto the cart, and drive it through the city gates, claiming it was a delivery for the cavalry at Ruthven Barracks. Once they were out of Edinburgh, they would turn and head for Glasgow, where crooked merchants would pay a fortune for such an amount of pure silver. And it certainly was pure. In fact, it was the most beautiful material that Duncan had ever seen. Tomorrow, he would be a rich man. In a few days, he and Peasel would take their share, and he would have the money to buy a plot of land in the Highlands, perhaps even enough to travel the world. Yet, he wasn't happy. Everything had to be done in secret, for how could three peasants like him, Peasel and Shadowjack, claim to have honestly come by such wealth? He would have to leave Edinburgh without telling anyone and adopt another identity to buy his farm, and he would never see Heather again. He couldn't bear to spend his life slaving in some Edinburgh factory, but what was the use of having one's own land if you couldn't use your own name, and when you had no family or loved ones to share your riches with? And why shouldn't he take someone? In fact, why couldn't he take Heather? He'd always felt he had nothing to offer such a beautiful and talented girl, but now he would have enough money for both of them to live comfortably, and surely she must be tired of singing for a living in those cramped and filthy streets. She claimed to be a gypsy after all, so she must share his love of open skies and uncluttered spaces. He could take her away, look after her properly. His mind was made up. He hurried out of the underground city to find Heather, leaving Shadowjack and Peasel working unawares in the darkness below. Shadowjack put on a thick leather gloves and grasped the sides of the giant smelting dish. It bubbled above the forge, hooked onto a metal pole suspended between two wooden tripods. The blacksmith carefully tipped the container until a small amount of molten silver trickled into the curved stone mould on the vault floor. When it began to harden, he plucked the silver from the mould with iron tongs and hammered it into a proper horseshoe. Sparks drifted through the air and singed the smith's beard, but he was used to this and he paid no heed. Like Duncan, he was deep in thought. It was a shame to have to split all this lovely treasure with the boys. Then again, he had to admit that Peasel and Duncan had worked hard, and he certainly couldn't have pulled the job off without them, and besides, that boy Duncan was a tough character, and Peasel certainly wasn't stupid. It was only money after all. He just needed enough to get to America, find some unclaimed land and open his own smithy there, for that was the work he loved. Shadowjack held up the finished horseshoe, swept it through a pile of soot and dirt, and plunged it into the bucket of water, causing a mighty blast of steam to rise into the air. Peasel sat at the bottom of the rock pile, trying to draw a proper lungful of air. In the last few days, his breathing had become more and more laboured, and now bouts of coughing racked his frail body. The boy's health was rapidly becoming worse, and he suspected that he had consumption, but he had to keep going until he had his share of the treasure. Because he couldn't afford real medical treatment. Thank goodness there were only a couple of pieces left. He struggled to his feet, but another fit of coughing forced him back to his knees. He wiped the back of his hand across his trembling mouth, and then it came away smeared red. The pickpocket clenched his fists, gritting his bloody teeth, and forced himself to stand. Still coughing, he picked up a helmet and with a breathless sob staggered back into the tunnel. Heather was singing at the bottom of Blair Street, as she always seemed to be. It occurred to Duncan that for a gypsy she seemed remarkably fond of staying in one spot. She saw him, and he came down the hill and quickly finished her song, waving goodbye to the clapping gents as she ran over. She gave Duncan a hug, standing on tiptoe to get her arms around his neck. "Hey, stranger," she said breathlessly. I haven't seen you all week. Work, 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 that's me, the Highlander replied solemnly. He motioned for the girl to sit next to him. Heather, I think we need to talk. I thought you were ignoring me. Heather grinned and sat down. Why so serious? Oh, I forgot you're always serious. The Highlander smiled at the mild rebuke and took her hand. What would you do if you had enough money to get out of Edinburgh? He said. I don't have enough money, that is. Suppose I got it. I've lived too long in this city to make wishes. I might be on to something. Duncan ran a hand through his long dark hair, unsure of how to finish. Something that will make me, well, awfully rich. What are you talking about? Have you broken the law? Are you in trouble? Oh, for goodness sake, the Highlander thumped a hand in his knee. Have I been a plain speaker? I didn't ken any other way. Me and Peasel found treasure, a lot of treasure, at the bottom of the underground city, under an old well. Well, we've almost finished taking it out, and there's enough to make all of us. His voice trailed away. What's wrong? Heather's face had gone white. Treasure. She put a trembling hand on the Highlander's knee. At the bottom of a well. Incredible, isn't it? Is it silver? Weapons and armour made of silver? Aye, silver. The Highlander's delight turned to puzzlement. Wait a minute. How did you ken that? Duncan, I think we need to talk. Shadow Jack saw the rope suspended over the well jerk several times, a sign that Peasel was pulling at the other end. He put down his tongs and walked over the hole. How many more, lad? He shouted down. I've tied a helmet to the rope. You can pull it up now. Peasel's voice drifted up. Sounded exhausted. There's only a shield left, but it's bigger than all the other pieces. There's a fit of coughing from the darkness. I don't know that I can carry it, Shadow Jack. It looks awful heavy. Go back to the rockfall and have a rest, wee man, Shadow Jack shouted back. I'll melt the helmet, then climb down and help you. Will do. The helmet clanked back and forth against the sides of the shaft as the blacksmith pulled it up. When it reached the top, he leant over the well and untied it from the rope. As he finished unfastening the rope, a blast of cold air hit him, rising from the black depths. Shadow Jack shivered violently and dropped the helmet, then peered into the hole bemused. He'd been working in this vault, hauling water and then bits of armour into the shaft for 3 long months, and he'd never felt slightly cold before. Now, for some reason, the hairs were standing up on the back of his neck, and his callous skin was covered in goosebumps. Peasel trudged back to the rock pile and lowered himself onto the floor. It seemed chillier down here than it had ever been before. He set his aching back against a boulder, stretching and twisting to try and relieve the pain in his tired muscles. He picked up a little flask of whiskey that Shadow Jack had given him and took a sip. He shuddered and put it down quickly. I can't believe people drink this stuff for fun. But he had to admit Shadow Jack's medicine had warmed him a little, and after a while his neck bent and he closed his eyes. Suddenly there was a sharp noise to his left. His head jerked up. A small stone tumbled down the rock pile, landed a few feet away. Peasel sighed in relief, unclenching his fists. Oh, I will be so happy when I get out of this place, he wheezed, sinking back. My imagination is starting to get the better of me. But for some reason that he couldn't quite fathom, the pickpocket did not dare close his eyes again. We gypsies know many legends, Duncan. Heather looked at the Highlander straight in the eye. And to be honest, some are just make-believe, but others we don't take lightly. That's the same in the Highlands, Duncan agreed. What of it? There is a legend, she continued in whispered tones, that I think that you should hear about. According to the gypsies, many centuries ago, one of the little people was a great magician called Galhadrian, exiled from Galhadria for a reason I do not know. His heart was filled with bitterness, and he decided that if he could not live on his own land, he would set up a kingdom on earth. Lily pointed to the hill, always ominously present over Edinburgh's rooftops. In a great cavern under Arthur's seat, he created an army of goblins and trolls called the Galhadrian Wrath, and favoured them with magical artefacts, including a cup that bestowed eternal life on anyone who drank from it. They terrorised the humans who lived in the area, and though the little people disapproved of what Galhadrian was doing, they did nothing, for magical creatures do not fight each other. Why not? Asked Duncan surlily. We humans don't have a problem killing our own. I only know that this is the rule of the little people, and they dare not break. We must not fight each other, she shrugged cynically. And even if that rule did not exist, Galhadrians care only for music, dancing and merriment. They do not care much about men. But Galhadrian had a daughter who could not bear to see the evil done by one of her own kin. When a Scots army gathered to fight the Galhadrian wrath, she led them to a hidden cache of fairy silver, knowing full well that fairy silver was deadly to the dark creatures. The Scots forged it into weapons and armour, including one magnificent sword, Excalibur, which was given to the Scottish leader, Arturius. Excalibur? Arturius? Duncan interrupted. You mean King Arthur? I thought King Arthur was just a legend. It's legends that we are speaking of, Heather said. You must decide whether this one is true. Duncan nodded solemnly, and the girl continued. Some of the Scots led a night raid on the Galhadrian Wrath stronghold and stole the magic artefacts. When the Galhadrian Wrath, led by the mighty warrior chief Mordred, gave chase, they were met by Arturius and the rest of his warriors. Galhadrian's army could not harm those Scots who wore silver armour and could themselves be killed by warriors wielding weapons made from fairy silver. Even so, there was not nearly enough silver to go round, and few Scots were properly protected. So the battle raged all night, until only a handful of fighters were alive on both sides. As dawn broke, the Galhadrian Wrath fled into the tunnel leading to the cavern under Arthur's seat. Arturius, though mortally wounded, led his few remaining men into the mountain after the creatures. They sealed the entrance to the cavern with rocks and placed their silver weapons and armour in front as a barrier to stop the Galhadrian Wrath ever getting out. Even Excalibur was left in there. The Scots melted down a few pieces of fairy silver and set them in a stout door further up the tunnel, and as a final precaution, they erected a fort at the tunnel entrance to always be ready if the Galhadrian Wrath got out. The fort eventually became Edinburgh Castle, and the hill under which Galhadrian's army was trapped was named Arthur's Seat. Lily indicated the slope in the distance. Galhadrian vanished into the remote north and left his minions to their terrible fate. What happened to the magic artefacts? The Highlander said. What happened to the girl? Nobody remembers, Heather said simply. It's quite a story. Duncan felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. There's more, Heather continued, and you won't like it. No, I get the feeling of Winnie, the Highlander agreed. The Scots also sealed up a nearby well, the only other entrance to the tunnel. Over hundreds of years, the treasure of the tunnel, Arthur, and the well drifted into legend, and the city of Edinburgh was built on top of them. Heather bit her lip. If the legend is true, then it's not treasure that you're stealing. It's the bars of an ancient prison. She held out a hand. Duncan, I'm sorry. But Duncan was already on his feet and running towards the underground city. Oh my goodness. What have they let out? Oh, good grief. Anyway, clean your teeth, guys. Keep washing your hands, and give yourself a great big huge cuddle before you go to sleep. I'll be back tomorrow for the next chapter. Night night. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is chapter 11, The Battle. Peasel stood up and stamped his feet. It was definitely getting colder, too cold to sit around any longer. At least that's what he tried to tell himself. In fact, he felt incredibly vulnerable, sitting in the flickering pool of firebrand light, all on his own. He hoped that Shadow Jack was almost finished smelting the helmet on the upper level. The pickpocket took a deep breath, and this time he didn't cough. If he was careful and he took things gently, he could possibly get that last shield back to the bottom of the well on his own. A few steps, then a rest, then a few steps. The hardest part would be getting it from the top of the rock pile. He'd just wait for a couple more minutes to get his breath back properly, then he would give it a go. Duncan raced through the underground city, moving over the dark and uneven floor with the grace of a natural hunter. He powered into Shadowjack's vault and cleared the fiery forge with one leap, his foot catching the astonished blacksmith in the centre of his chest. The blow, with the force of a 100-yard run behind it, caught the giant totally by surprise, and he toppled backwards with a grunt. As he crashed to the floor, Shadowjack instinctively lifted the heavy tongs to strike the boy, but Duncan's knife suddenly glinted in the firelight, right below the smith's left eye. "You make one move," Duncan spat, his face inches from the blacksmith's own, "and you will never see the money you badly wish to spend." "What is this treachery, boy?" Shadowjack let go of the tongs and held up his empty hand. "Tell me quick, I've always played fair with you." "You didn't tell us about the monsters." Duncan wrapped his fingers in the blacksmith's bristling beard and pulled him even closer. "That's why the gypsies you overheard never came looking for the treasure, isn't it? You told us about the silver, you treacherous dog, but you didn't tell us about the monsters." "Monsters?" the giant roared. "What are you talking about, boy?" "The silver guard's a great evil. It can't be taken out." "What?" The blacksmith's eyes were almost bulging out of his head. "That stupid fairy story. Only an ignorant peasant would believe something like that. I didn't think it was even worth mentioning." "Well, I believe in fairy stories," Duncan hissed. He lifted himself off Shadowjack's chest and stood up, still brandishing the knife. "I lost my brother to the little people, and I'm not going to lose my best friend." "You're brave to anger a man like me, Highlander." Shadowjack sat up, his face red with rage, and also very foolish. He struggled to his feet and stepped forward, towering above Duncan. The boy was not cowed. "If I am wrong, then I apologise to you, blacksmith, and my shame will be great." Duncan tucked his knife back into the little leather sheath under his arm. "But I fear the worst." "Oh, nonsense," Shadowjack fumed. "I'm on my way down to help Peasel take out that last piece of treasure right now. When we brought it up, I want to hear no more of this ignorant babble." "The last piece already?" "Aye," Shadowjack scowled. "We're not all sitting around thinking up daft children's stories, you know. That boy down there is working like a dog." "Shadowjack, I beg you to trust me on this." Duncan moved to the well. "Stoke up the fire as high as it'll go, please." The Highlander sat himself on the edge and grasped the rope. "I'll explain when I return, and if I'm wrong, you can laugh at me while you count your money." A self-mocking smile played on his lips, but his eyes burnt into Shadowjack's with an intensity that made the blacksmith suddenly look down. Then Duncan slid over the well rim and into the darkness. Shadowjack stood for a few minutes, staring at the black hole, stroking his beard. Then he turned back and quickly began to pile wood on the forge. The shield made a grinding noise as Peasel slid it down the rock pile. But he knew the silver would be undamaged by the jagged stone. He had once overheard a learned gent claim that precious metals scratched and broke easily. But this stuff seemed indestructible. Peasel was beginning to doubt these learned gents were ever right about anything. The shield slid off the last rock and hit the floor with a clang, and the pickpocket began to drag it down the passage that led to the bottom of the well. He'd gone about 50 yards when it occurred to him that he'd left Shadowjack's liquor flask back at the rock pile, and sighing, he trudged back to get it. He was stuffing the container back inside his shirt when he heard footsteps pounding up the corridor in his direction. "No need to hurry, Shadowjack, I'm managing just fine." He looked around as a running figure emerged from the darkness. "Duncan, what are you doing down here?" Duncan slowed to a halt, his chest heaving. "Are you all right?" "Aye, why wouldn't I be? I've been coughing, that's all." Peasel's reply was drowned out by a deafening crack. A slab of stone, the size of the pickpocket, shot out of the rock pile like a cork out of a champagne bottle, shattering into 1,000 pieces on the cavern wall opposite. Duncan launched himself at Peasel, knocking him over and flattening him to the ground. The pickpocket's firebrand spun into the air and clattered around across the floor as pieces of boulder rained down around them. A chunk the size of a brick hit Duncan between the shoulders, and 1,000 points of pain burst across the back of his head. He slumped forward on top of the pickpocket. "Duncan, you're squashing me!" Peasel tried to roll the half-conscious Highlander off, and then froze as he peered out from under his friend's motionless body. An arm jutted out of the hole where the rock had been, long and powerful, and twice the size of one of Shadow Jack's powerful limbs. But this arm was so white it was almost translucent, hairless with thick blue veins and spattered with patches of grey mould. And the hand on the end was more like a claw, curved, twitching and bristling with vicious yellow talons. "Heaven save us!" Peasel whispered, thumping his groggy friend on his shoulder. "Duncan, get up, please!" With a shudder, the rocks around the arm rose and parted, and a head and shoulders burst out. Peasel screamed. The huge cranium was bald and misshapen, with eyes sunk so far into the creature's doughy flesh that they were no more than malevolent little beads. The monster pulled its body slowly out of the gap, squat, wide, and bent almost double, as if an eternity of squeezing through low passages had permanently curved the massive knotted spine. It opened a cavernous mouth, revealing 2 rows of gleaming, jagged teeth, and stepped down from the rock pile, almost daintily, though its powerful, sinewy legs ended in hooves rather than feet. Another head, equally ugly, burst from the rocks a few feet away. "Duncan, we have got to get out of here!" Peasel hissed, twisting his friend's head in the direction of the aberrations and slapping his face. "Please, please, please!" Duncan finally got his eyes to focus, and his head jerked backwards. With a grunt of agony, he pushed himself groggily to his feet, pulling Peasel up with him, but by now a third small creature was forcing its way up through the stone, and the first 2 were clearing the rock pile and standing on the chamber floor itself. "What in God's name are they?" Peasel whimpered. "Demons, trolls, I dunna ken." The imminent danger had sharpened Duncan's senses despite the pain. "Whatever they are, we can't let them get between us and the way back." The monsters were crouching and then stretching, sniffing the air in each other. Grabbing Peasel's hand, the Highlander began to inch along the wall. At least they didn't seem to see very well. The 2 closest trolls glanced at the boys and then over at the exit. With ugly, leering grins, they moved to block the boys' retreat. "Nothing's wrong with their hearing, Duncan." Peasel tried to shrink back further into the shadows, but it was too late. The 3rd troll had now joined his companions on the floor, and a 4th was beginning to emerge from the rocks. "It's no use, we're trapped." Duncan pulled out his knife and held it valiantly in front of him. "When I attack, you run to the right. Follow the wall, you'll only have a few seconds." "When you attack?" Peasel grabbed his friend's arm. "What are you talking about?" "No point in both of us dying," Duncan said calmly, despite his racing heart. "Go to the right, like I say." The trolls looked at each other, and one snorted loudly. The boys could smell a blast of fetid breath. The nearest could be more than 12 feet away. "What if they understand Scots?" Peasel stammered. "You just told them which way I'm going to go." "Then pick your own way, surprise me." "No, Duncan." The pickpocket picked up a chunk of broken stone. "You are my only friend, and by my soul we'll live or we'll die together." The trolls edged towards the boys, hooves clicking on the stone floor and thin black lips curling back over their massive drooling teeth. They hunched down and stretched their claws out in front, grunting and panting and waving their heads from side to side. Duncan shifted the knife from hand to hand. "Goodbye, Peasel," he said gently. With a mighty roar, Shadow Jack barreled into the cavern, swinging the silver shield around his head. The corner of the shield caught the troll nearest to him, and half its malformed head vanished in a black, oily cloud. The other creatures spun around, releasing a cacophony of ear-splitting screams, recoiling when they caught sight of the gleaming silver. "To me, boys!" Shadowjack raced across the vault. The shield connected with the outstretched claw of one of the trolls and sliced it clean off. The white clutching hand flew through the air and landed at Peasel's feet. Galvanised, he and Duncan leapt out the shadows and darted over to where Shadowjack was swinging the shield maniacally back and forth. At each thrust, the monsters shrank away, waving their arms ineffectually. "Duncan, my lad," the blacksmith roared as the boys sheltered behind him, "I've decided that there is no need for you to apologise at all." "Glad to hear it," Duncan said as the trio began backing into the tunnel that led to the well. "Now, give me the shield." "What? Shadowjack, you said you'd trust me. Give me the shield. I need you to do exactly what I say." Duncan grabbed the shield before the blacksmith could object. "Run back to the well, take Peasel, although you might have to carry him." Peasel was stumbling alongside them, coughing violently again. "I've no time to explain, but I have a plan. Just climb back up to the vault and start melting the silver horseshoes in the forge." "Why? I mean, how many?" "All of them, Shadowjack, or else we're all dead. Go!" The blacksmith looked as if he was about to object, but an unearthly scream of rage rose from the chamber that they'd just left. Instead, he scooped Peasel under one meaty arm and set off towards the bottom of the well. Duncan turned and faced the direction of the enemy, shield in hand, as the pursuing trolls clattered into the tunnel. They stopped when they saw his defence and hissed and spat and screamed, but dare not go any further. Duncan was facing the worst nightmare ever, and he felt like collapsing with pain and terror, but he was a boy with a long line of warrior blood in his veins. "Right, you dirty wee devils," he yelled, for want of anything more appropriate to say. "Let's see you take on a Highlander. Yes, you, with your pasty faces and your bad breath." The trolls retreated a few feet, snarling and gurgling amongst themselves. Their bent and bloated bodies almost filled the corridor, but Duncan could see at least 5 of them now, crowding behind the leader. 2 of the monsters at the back suddenly turned and loped away, the tapping of their hooves fading into the distance. The Highlander knew immediately what they were up to. There were many branching tunnels in this labyrinth. His adversaries were going to circle round and find another route to the well, catching Peasel and Shadowjack unawares and cutting off their retreat. Well, hope you enjoyed that. I hope it doesn't give you nightmares. Now, guys, clean teeth. What you have to do every single night. Wash your hands all the time. It's so important. Snuggle into your bed, give yourself a great big huge cuddle, and hopefully I will see you again tomorrow night. Night-night. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I'm reading from Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is the second part of Chapter 11, The Battle. There was nothing else for it. With a blood-curdling Highland yell, Duncan charged at the enemy. The 3 remaining trolls were taken completely by surprise. Turning in panic, they tried to scramble over each other, spitting and clawing in an attempt to get away, but their bodies were just too large in such confined spaces to manoeuvre properly. Duncan swung the shield and caught the nearest creature square in the back. A huge gount of black liquid arched from between its shoulders as it fell, writhing and screaming. His second swing took the upraised arm from the second monster, before they thundered, squealing in terror, back the way they came. Duncan shouldered the shield, spun on his heel, and headed in the direction that Shadowjack had gone. Peasel was standing shivering, knee-deep in water at the bottom of the well shaft when Duncan finally reached the chamber. "Shadowjack's at the top, melting the horseshoes. Back down again," he coughed weakly. "Seems a shame, after all the effort we put into making them in the first place. Then get up there after them. These beasties will be here any second. I can't hold them off, not even with a silver shield. The pickpocket shook his head. I haven't got the strength to climb, Duncan. Besides, I thought you might need this. He thrust his arm into the black water and pulled out a beautiful silver sword. Where in the name of the wee man did you get that? Duncan gasped. I hid it behind a rock a couple of weeks ago when I first found this place. He held out the weapon out of pure greed, you know. Duncan took the sword reverently. Peasel, you never ceased to amaze me. The bucket and rope came tumbling down the funnel and splashed into the water, narrowly missing the pickpockets. The horseshoes are melting away just fine, Shadow Jack's voice echoed down. Grab hold of the rope, lad. Take the shield with you. Duncan thrust it out. Melt it down too. Melt everything that's silver. Then throw the rope back for me. Too weak to protest, Peasel hoisted the shield onto his back and sat on the bucket. Haul away, Shadow Jack, Duncan shouted. The boy, bucket and shield, rose unhesitatingly into the air and disappeared into the chamber roof. Duncan could hear Shadow Jack grunting as he pulled. The Highlander turned, sword in hand, in time to see the first troll slither into the chamber. Then another entered, and another, until 12 of the monstrosities were bunched together in the vault. One gestured violently, and the creatures began to fan out, gurgling and slobbering and inching in both directions along the chamber wall, until eventually they ringed the Highlander. The boy circled on the spot, holding out the sword, but he knew he was lost. He could kill 5, 6, maybe even more, but in the end, they'd just overcome him by sheer weight of numbers. The bucket landed in the water again, and the trolls recoiled in surprise. That was the split second that Duncan needed. He rammed his foot into it and grasped the rope with one hand. Pull, Shadow Jack, pull, or my life is over. Shadow Jack gave a tremendous roar of exertion from above, and Duncan shot into the air. Seeing their victim about to escape, the trolls rushed forward en masse. The largest leaping into the air towards them, talons outstretched, Duncan swung the sword in a vicious arc, and the creature's clawing arm was sliced from its body. The monster fell back into the water with a scream. You beasties are not going to have any arms left by the time we're finished with you, the Highlander shouted triumphantly as he vanished up the funnel. Peasel was waiting at the top to help Duncan clamber out of the well and into Shadow Jack's vaults. The blacksmith had simply dumped the huge smelting dish onto the red-hot coals of his forge and then thrown in all the horseshoes. And the Highlander could see the shield dissolving into the mass of bubbling molten metal that almost reached the top of the huge container. Shadow Jack gave a whistle when he saw the sword. Whew, that is a piece and a half, and no mistake. Can't believe we missed that the first time, he said, suspiciously eyeing the weapon. You want that melted down as well? I didn't think we'd better, said Duncan, holding up the sword in awe. I'm thinking this might be the legendary Excalibur itself. Aye, right. I'll wager on it. Could we just get back to your plan, Duncan, whatever it is? Peasel pointed down the well. These things are climbing. Tip out the molten silver, the Highlander pointed to the dish. Tip it down the well. What? Shadow Jack held up his hands in horror. That's our fortune. And how will you spend it? From the grave? Shadow Jack groaned in disbelief, then spun and grabbed a stout cudgel leaning against the wall of the vault. He rammed it into the glowing coals below the dish. Help me then, lads, quick now before this goes up in flames, he shouted, putting all of his considerable weight on the staff. The boys ran to his side, and all three of them pushed down as hard as they could. The container creaked slowly and lifted a few inches above the forge. Once more, boys, with all your might, push! The trio wrenched down onto the staff again, grunting in pain and effort, and the desperation of people whose lives hung on a thread. The huge dish rose slowly out of the forge and toppled onto its side, and 1/2 ton of molten silver surged out the container and flowed into the well. There was an unholy scream from inside the funnel as the liquid metal engulfed the climbing trolls and swept them back into the depths. The creatures that filled the chamber below tried to escape as the molten silver hit the river at the bottom, but it was too late. A giant cloud of steam, saturated with droplets of silver, filled the vault instantly and shot along the tunnels at the bottom, enveloping the fleeing trolls. In a matter of seconds, the Galhadrian Wrath, who had survived for a millennium and a half, were blasted out of existence. Shadowjack, Peasel and Duncan lay on their backs in the vaults, coughing and gasping and laughing with joy. "We did it!" Shadowjack thumped Duncan on the chest. "Poor as church mice again, aye, but alive all the same." "Not exactly." Duncan held Excalibur above his head. "This thing has a jewel set in it the size of a hen's egg." "Well, poor or not poor, let us get out of here." Shadowjack sat up. "I, for one, don't intend to spend one more day locked away from daylight. Not as long as I live." He stretched out his arm, helped Peasel to his feet, and then reached back at Duncan. As he did so, a mournful howl rose from the depth of the well, a sound more powerful, more nerve-jangling, and strangely enough, more human than any the other trolls had made. Shadowjack froze in mid-pool. "Oh my God!" Peasel clutched the blacksmith's arm. "What was that?" "Mordred, that would be my guess," said Duncan flatly. "Their war chief. Clever wee beastie. He must have stayed well back while the rest attacked." "How do you know all this stuff?" "Never mind. What'll we do?" "Well, whatever it is, we better do it quick." Shadowjack hauled Duncan onto his feet with a mighty tug. The trio could hear hoofbeats growing louder, rattling down the tunnel towards the bottom of the well. Mordred was coming. "The dish." The pickpocket pointed to the container lying on its side. "There's enough silver left, crusted on the bottom of the dish, inside and out, to stop whatever's down there ever getting past it. It looks like it might fit in the well." "Only one way to find out." Shadowjack flexed his mighty arms, picked up the container with a muscle-popping heave, and slammed it into the hole in the vault floor. It slid in almost to its brim, but the lip prevented it from sinking any further. Shadowjack stepped back, waving his arms in the air. "Oh, still a bit hot that," he said through gritted teeth. Mordred knew it too. There was another venomous roar from the bottom of the well, then a rat-tat-tat-tat of Mordred's hooves, thundering back down the passage as the monster searched in vain for another way out of the lower level. Duncan pushed at the smelting container with his foot, but it didn't budge. "You think that there's any way that thing can get out?" "I doubt it," Peasel said. "I've been down there, remember." "Well, what if someone removes this dish? This vault already has a bad enough reputation. After all that unearthly screaming and drumming, can't see anyone ever coming near it again." "Just in case, we can block up the stairs that lead down here," Shadowjack said. "Wait a minute." Peasel went to the back of the vault and fetched his journal. "Whatever that thing trapped down there might be, it has lived for a long, long time, and it isn't likely to die any time soon." He opened the book and he began to write. "Gather as many loose rocks as you can to hide the well. I'm going to finish my diary and I'm going to leave it here as a warning in case anyone ever finds this place again." "I think we should hide the sword for some reason." Duncan looked admiringly at the weapon. "We just prize the jewel out of the hilt first. It's big enough to make us all wealthy." Shadowjack and Duncan silently scoured the vault and the adjoining corridors for suitable debris while Peasel completed his journal. They wrapped the book in one of Shadowjack's smelting gloves, left it in the dish, pulled a plank over the top and covered it with rocks. "I told you someday that you would write something important." Duncan patted Peasel on the shoulder. The pickpocket didn't smile. "I pity the poor soul that finds this," he said. Then, with Excalibur wrapped in an old oilskin cloth, Peasel, Duncan and Shadowjack Henry walked out of the underground city and into the sun. Whew. Right, guys, Tomorrow night I'll be reading chapter 12, The Body Snatcher. But I want you to go and clean your teeth, do all this hand washing, it is so important. Then into bed, snuggle down, give yourself a great big huge cuddle because you deserve it. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Night night. Hello there, my name is Sarah and I'm reading Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is chapter 12, The Body Snatcher. Charlie turned the page, but there was nothing else written in the book. He flicked through the rest of Peasel's diary, but from that point on, the journal was blank. He stood up, ignoring Lily, pacing around the theatre floor. The girl sat and waited, running a small silver ball over her fingers from one hand to another. Finally, Charlie turned to her tight-lipped. "There is no way I'm believing that," he burst out. "There's no way I'm believing that there's some kind of monster trapped at the bottom of the underground city." Lily stayed quiet. "I know what you're thinking. That tapping I heard when I was underground was the sound of Mordred's hooves. You think he heard me and he came running up the passageway below?" "You don't know what I think." "Well, it's rubbish. That noise I heard was council workers digging, just like you said." "Could be," Lily shrugged. "I wasn't down there." "I don't believe in that kind of stuff. The journal must just be a hoax." "Oh, sit down, Charlie," Lily said. "Trying to make sense out of this and walk at the same time is freaking you out." The boy slouched back down and patted his knees, nervously blowing out his cheeks. "All right," said after a while. "Just suppose the diary is right. I'm just saying suppose. I'm not saying it is." He began to get up again, but Lily pulled him back down. "All right, suppose," she said. "What are you going to do?" "All I have to do is make sure that nobody ever finds Shadowjack's vault again. I mean, Mordred's still trapped, isn't he? I'll go down and cover the smelting forge and hide the stairway I found that leads to the vault, put the stones back, put everything back the way it was." He smiled hopefully at Lily. "If there is some sort of horrible creature down there, well, that'll keep it hidden for another 200 years. "Yeah, I suppose it would," said Lily. "If it wasn't for the fact that there are council workers digging straight towards them. If they break through into the bottom level, Mordred will surely kill them." "That guy stays angry for a long time, eh? Worse still, he'll be out." "Couldn't we just tell the police or the army or something?" the boy suggested. "What? Tell them what? You discovered a 1,000-year-old troll living under the streets of Edinburgh. They're not likely to believe that." "Yeah, I know the feeling." "You have to do something. So what if he does get out?" Charlie was clutching at straws now. How dangerous can he be? Magic or not, he's only one creature. The girl looked deep into his eyes. "What if he breaks out when your parents are performing in the big top?" Charlie leapt to his feet. "What do you expect me to do? Take him on hand-to-hand combat? I'm only a kid." Lily pointed to Peasel's diary. "2 boys about your age once managed to beat a whole army of trolls. Yet with the help of a magic sword and a blacksmith the size of Mount Everest." With a flick of her wrist, Lily sent the silver ball whizzing towards Charlie's head. He plucked it out of the air within an inch of his nose, blinking in surprise. "What the hell did you do that for?" "Your parents are acrobats," you said. "Look at how easily you caught that ball. You've inherited their speed and their eye." "I'd rather my parents were big game hunters and I'd inherited their guns. What am I supposed to fight this thing with? My teeth?" He gave the girl a sarcastic look. "I've got silver fillings. Do you think that'll help?" Lily didn't get the joke. Only fairy silver will work against these kind of creatures. "But you're on the right track. You have to think of what you have on your side, Charlie, not what you don't." "I've got you. You want to come into the underground city with me?" "No, not a chance." "I thought not," the boy said dryly. "But thanks for your support." He flicked the ball back. "Charlie, I didn't mean it like that." I've got to think about this." Charlie strode towards the theatre exit. "I have to go somewhere and work this out. It's not that I'm stupid or a coward." He opened the door, letting in a flood of sunlight. "It's just that I'm scared to death and don't have a clue what to do." He stepped into the light without bothering to say goodbye. The door closed with a click, leaving Lily sitting alone in the gloomy big top. She took out 3 more silver balls and began to juggle them. 13, then 15, then 17, spinning faster and faster despite the half-light. One of the silver balls hit the edge of her finger and shot away at an awkward angle. She tried to recapture the moment, clutching at empty air, but another ball deflected off her wrist and vanished under the chair. Next moment, all the balls were bouncing across the floor away from the astonished girl. Lily looked at her hands. "Not fair," she said to no one in particular. "Not fair at all." Charlie sat in his room at the boarding house. He'd been there for hours staring at the wall, though his parents had interrupted him a couple of times and tried unsuccessfully to make conversation. "Wednesday tomorrow," his father said. "Big Top's shut, so I thought about taking you on a day trip. There's a pencil museum in Lerwick." "Oh, I'd love to go," Charlie said. "Really? You would?" "Yes, but I can't," Charlie thought fast. "I have to meet a girl." "A girl, eh?" said his father. "You think a girl will be more fun than a pencil museum?" "Don't tease the boy." Charlie's mum somersaulted onto the bed beside her son, and they both bounced up and down for a few seconds. "What would you like to know about the facts of life?" "Nothing, mother. We'll probably just go for a Coke." "Ah, young love," his mum nudged him, wrinkling her nose. "Do you think about her a lot?" "As a matter of fact, I've thought about nothing else all evening." Charlie looked up at his mother. "And I don't think she's being very honest. I think she's been using me." "Oh, baby." His mother suddenly looked serious, which didn't happen very often. "Are you going to be all right? You want to talk about it?" For a second, Charlie considered telling his parents the whole story, just giving them Peasel's journal to read and then climbing into bed and going to sleep. Let them work out what was real and what was not and what he should do. He looked at his father hopefully. His father made a high whinnying noise, his cheeks vibrating violently. "That is my impression of a horse," he said. "I can only do it with one side of my mouth." Charlie turned to his mother. "It's okay," he said, patting her hand. "Everything is okay. You have a talk with this young lady. Don't let her walk all over you." "I don't intend to." "Good. Well, you have fun tomorrow. Dad and I can have a long lie and go shopping instead." Charlie's dad sighed. Finally, his parents went to bed and left Charlie to his thoughts. He was sick to his stomach about what he'd learnt, and he had racked his brains in vain for a logical explanation. He felt betrayed by Lily, even though he hardly knew her, and he felt lonely. He'd come to think of Peasel and Duncan as friends, and now that the diary was finished, he would never know what happened to them. Did they take Excalibur to Glasgow and sell it? Did they become rich like they'd dreamt? Or had Peasel succumbed to an illness that was obviously killing him? Charlie opened the pickpocket's diary and flipped through it again. At the back was the pickpocket's hand-drawn map of Greyfriars Graveyard. There were little ticks scattered across the page, presumably marking the sites of the recently buried corpses ripe for stealing. Looking closer at the map, he suddenly noticed that one plot was marked with a tiny cross rather than a tick. He held the book closer and, peering at the minuscule marking, was it a cross? Or was it a sword? Then suddenly Charlie knew exactly where Excalibur was. He leapt to his feet, opened the boarding house window, climbed onto the sill, and without a second's hesitation, swung out and clambered down the drain pipe. Soon he was walking through the silent, deserted streets once more, his mind in turmoil. He reached the big top, let himself in, and felt his way to the little vault in Southbridge, where the workmen kept their tools. He took out one of the construction helmets with the light on top, put it on his head, and wrapped a short shovel in a splattered paint sheet. Then he let himself out to the theatre again and strode through the old town until he stood at the gates of Greyfriars Graveyard. The cemetery looked very different at night. The church seemed to be carved from squat, cold shadows, and gravestones were scattered across the inky lawns like blackened stumps of teeth. Charlie switched on the torch and made his way quietly round the church until he came to the grave of Alan Ramsay, hidden in thick shadow at the bottom of the building. Hands shaking, he unwrapped the shovel, looked around to see if his actions might be detected, but the graveyard was deserted and all the lights were off in the surrounding tenements. He opened Peasel's journal at the back, studied the exact position of the cross. "Here we go," the boy muttered. The last of the body snatchers. He took a deep breath and plunged the shovel into the soil a few feet from the flat tombstone and began to dig. He worked in silence, trying to keep his breathing as quiet as possible. He didn't want anyone sneaking up behind him whilst he was busy digging up a grave in the middle of the night. Soon there was a mound of earth beside him and a widening hole at his feet. Suddenly, the point of the shovel hit something solid. "Please don't let that be someone's head," Charlie muttered, digging tentatively around the spot, but the object he was uncovering glinted in his helmet beam. It was made of metal. The sky was beginning to lighten, so he scraped hurriedly at the dirt, and soon he had uncovered a beautiful sword handle. Hardly daring to breathe, he bent down, grasped the handle, and pulled. Excalibur slid slowly and easily from the soil next to the grave of Peasel's hero, and Charlie held the dirt-covered weapon aloft, saluting his companion from the past. "You did hide the sword," he laughed, wiping dirt from the hilt with his sleeve. "You took the jewel and left the sword in case someone else needed to use it." His voice trailed away as the last of the graveyard earth fell from the hilt. The jewel was still there, gleaming in its silver setting. He sat down on Alan Ramsay's tombstone, looking at the beautiful sword, and a great feeling of sadness welled up inside him. Partly he was uncertain and scared, but partly he could understand how he had got into an incredible situation like this. But mostly he was sad for Peasel. He didn't know why the jewel was buried with the sword, but the fact it was still there meant that Peasel, Shadowjack and Duncan couldn't have got rich after all. Without money, the pickpocket wouldn't have been able to afford proper medicine. Charlie didn't think that Peasel could have lasted much longer after finishing his diary. The boy felt a welcome warmth on his back as the sun began to rise over the eastern wall of the graveyard. He raised Excalibur above his head and let the rays of the new day dance along its blade. "Thank you, my friend," he whispered. He stood up and made a few practiced cuts at the air with the weapon. He had no idea how to wield a sword, but Excalibur was light and somehow it felt right in his hand. He edged his way around Ramsay's grave, slashing at imaginary foes, imagining he was Arturius, surrounded by the army of the Galhadrian Wrath. He clutched his heart. "You got me, you pesky varmints," he croaked, staggering backwards and forwards. "But before I die, I'll chase you down to the very gates of hell and seal you in." Charlie stopped, Excalibur quivering in the air. "I don't get it." He lowered the sword and frowned. Why would the Galhadrian Wrath retreat into a tunnel where they knew they could be trapped? Why didn't they just run away? He thought back to Peasel's diary. As dawn broke, the Galhadrian Wrath finally fled and took shelter in the caverns under Arthur's seat. Charlie looked at the golden orb getting higher over the graveyard wall. As dawn broke, of course. A grin of comprehension spread slowly across his face. There was something else that the Galhadrian Wrath feared as much as fairy silver. They were afraid of daylight. Brilliant. We're getting near the end. But I hope you guys have kept on cleaning your teeth every evening, washing your hands diligently, and now snuggle in. Nice big cuddle. Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Night-night. Hello there, my name is Sarah, and I am reading Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is chapter 13, The Monster. Charlie stepped into the theatre, construction helmet in one hand and paint cloth in the other. Lily was sitting in the empty front row of chairs, exactly where the boy had left her the evening before, her face pale and drawn. She looked as if she'd been there all night. "Where's your father, Lily?" Charlie said. "What?" The girl was taken aback by the unexpected question. "I don't know. I mean, where's your father on that?" The boy pointed at a huge poster adorning the theatre wall. It advertised the acts performing at the big top during the festival, and it was printed in fancy circus-style lettering. "Blackheart Entertainment presents the Edinburgh Festival Acrobatic Circus. the Flying Pollock Brothers, Bert the Human Bullet, the Bouncing Bruceys, Scalina the Mistress of the Wire, the Wonderful Wilsons, Dazzling Derek, and Deaky Bob the Wonder Dog. I remember my dad telling me this theatre is just for acrobats, apart from Deaky Bob the Wonder Dog, of course. He walked over and studied the poster more closely. You said your father was a magician, performing in this big top. Does your father advertised here? My father is a magician, Lily protested. How did you know that ordinary silver would work against Mordred? Charlie kept going. What are you talking about? Yesterday, you said that only fairy silver could beat Mordred. How did you know that? Oh, Lily threw up her hands. I didn't. It was a guess. It didn't sound like a guess. Charlie strode towards her. Why do I never see you anywhere except in this theatre? How come you know so much about Edinburgh's past? Why are you hounding me like this? Lily backed away from him. You said your father is a great magician. Where is he? Stop! The girl held up her hands, but the boy kept advancing. You're Goradin's daughter, aren't you? He pointed an accusing finger. You are one of the little people. You're the girl who led the Scots to the fairy silver, and you've been hanging around ever since. And you're Heather, the girl that Duncan liked. I'm right, aren't I? You seem to have it all worked out. Lily managed to sound impressed and resentful at the same time. Actually, it was a guess. Charlie looked sheepish. It was a good guess. The boy shrugged. It seems as if nothing was impossible anymore. He would just have to get used to it. The diary said Heather had dark hair, but yours is red. Suppose that's magic. No, it was dirt. You think 19th century gypsies can afford shampoo? Charlie laughed despite himself. He reached out, took her arm. She flinched as if she wasn't used to being touched. It's all right. Sit beside me. Despite her deceit, the boy found it impossible to stay angry with Lily. And besides, he needed answers fast. Any information that he could get from the girl right now might save his life. He flopped down on the chair. She sat next to him, looking at the floor. Why have you stayed here so long? Charlie said. Why don't you live in Galhadria with the rest of the little people? I don't know. No? You've had over 1,000 years to come up with a reason. I don't remember. The girl looked genuinely unsure. It was so long ago. Lily still didn't look up. My father, where exactly is he? I don't know that either. She was almost whispering now. He brought me from Galhadria to this world, and then he deserted me. I'm sorry about that. Charlie took her hand. I loved my father. Perhaps I wanted to make better what he did wrong. The boy squinted at her. Are you telling me that you've hung around the entrance to the underground city for a millennium just to stop Mordred and his gang from getting away? The girl put a trembling hand to her mouth. I thought someday my father might come back for me, she said finally. Got to admire your patience. Charlie gave her hand a squeeze. Then he let it go. Lily, he said, as evenly as he could, why won't you use your powers to kill Mordred? Why are you trying to make me do it instead? Lily finally looked up, her eyes wide and green. Magical creatures must not fight other magical creatures. It's a law so old that we no longer even think about it. She leant forward earnestly. But we know that if we break it, something terrible will happen. We just know. She shook her head and her red curls bobbed violently. I can't help you. I know. The boy couldn't hide his irritation. And little people don't interfere with humans either. For a magical race, you Galhadrians don't actually do an awful lot. You're not even supposed to know we exist. Lily squeezed her mortal companion's hand so tightly that the boy winced. Charlie, I'm doing my best. I've kept people out of Mordred's way for centuries. Now I'm trying to save the lives of these workmen. Yeah, by sending me instead. Lily sighed deeply. Mordred is proof that magic exists. If he gets out, your race will once again believe, but things are not like they used to be on Earth. Men might actually have the power to make magic work for them. Charlie frowned. That would be so bad. You developed weapons that can destroy your own world. Charlie, and that's without magic. Lily said sadly. What do you think? The boy picked up the paint cloth and unwrapped Excalibur. The blade glowed a ghostly blue in the dim light of the big top. Lily gasped when she saw it. There's no point hanging around here then, is there? He said, lifting the sword above his head and plunging it back down. The blade sunk into the stone floor as if it was made of butter. Charlie let go of Excalibur, and it quivered and sang, vibrating like a huge bee sting. I've got a monster to fight. Do you have a plan? Of course. Charlie stood up and placed the helmet with the flashlight on his head. I'm counting on Mordred laughing himself to death when he sees me. Let me fix this. Lily rose and fastened the strap of the hard hat under the boy's chin. She had to stand on her toes to reach, and the top half of her body pressed against his chest. Ooh, she felt cold. So what do I call you now? Charlie said. A little person? You can call me a friend, she said, looking into his eyes. Then she slid her arms around his waist and gave him a tentative hug. Her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. You have your parents' courage, she whispered in his ear. Remember, you also have their skill. Use it. She leant back, kissed him quickly on the lips, then held him by the shoulders at arm's length. Like a general expecting one of her troops, Charlie was surprised to see the girl's eyes glistening with tears. If I don't manage this, he began, but Lily put a finger to his lips. These are the first tears I have shed since my father vanished, she said softly, and suddenly the boy felt more confident, more powerful, and more loved than he had ever in his life. He lifted his hand to touch the girl's cheek just once, then turned and walked towards the door at the back of the theatre. Your sword! Lily motioned towards Excalibur, still upright and vibrating. I don't need it. Not yet, Charlie smiled and stepped through the door. Lily came back to the sword and crouched down beside it, admiring the intricate carvings on the flawless blade. She clenched her fists in a little gesture of triumph. He does have a plan, she said to Excalibur. I knew he would. I'm going to read the second part of that chapter tomorrow evening. I want you to clean your teeth, wash your hands, snuggle into your bed, give yourself a big, huge cuddle. Night-night. Hello there, my name is Sarah and I'm reading from Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson. This is part 2 of chapter 13, The Monster. Charlie searched around the little vault where the council workers kept their supplies until he found a small pulley that he had noticed on his first visit. He put it in his pocket, took a length of nylon rope from a shelf and wound it around his waist. Then he moved the debris covering the tunnel entrance, slid inside and began crawling back towards the lower levels of the underground city. He knew he could easily find Shadowjack Henry's vault again. All he had to do was follow the chalk marks that he'd made on the wall less than a week ago. Less than a week ago? He just couldn't believe it. Just 7 days ago, he was an ordinary boy living an ordinary life, and now he was marching down a hidden tunnel to do battle with an ancient monster. He wasn't the same boy anymore. The old Charlie wouldn't even have stood up to the school bully. Lily was sure that magic would be disastrous to men, and reluctantly he was forced to agree with her. This was not some petty classroom squabble, but a noble and valiant quest that might even save his whole race. He still wasn't sure it was worth fighting a monster for, though. When he reached Shadowjack's vault, the boy stood outside the doorway for several minutes until his breathing was under control and his heart had stopped pounding like a jackhammer. Once he was inside the vault, he would have to work quickly and calmly if he was to have any chance of succeeding, or staying alive for that matter. Hesitation is an acrobat's worst enemy, he said to himself, and stepped into the chamber. The hard hat's beam lit up the wooden triangle and iron hook at the base of the vault wall, the old apparatus that Shadowjack Henry once used to draw water for his forge. Charlie dragged it to within a few feet of the wall, positioning the apparatus between the blocked-up hole and the vault doorway. He unwound the rope from around his waist, threaded it through the detachable metal pulley that he took from his pocket, and fastened the pulley to the wooden triangle. Then he took the end of the rope that had been threaded through the pulley and tied it to the ancient hook. The metal was old and rusty, but still solid enough for its purpose. The rope and pulley system now formed the basis for a crude winch, and he slid the hook under the rim of the metal cylinder that blocked the well. He stepped back, wound the rest of the rope back around his waist, and then turned and began walking towards the vault exit. The rope tightened. Charlie gritted his teeth and kept going. The pulley jiggled, and there was a grinding sound from the metal dish. The boy pulled harder, though each tug tightened the rope around his waist, forcing the air from his lungs. The metal dish groaned again, and the rim slid up a few inches. Charlie grunted, trying to find a proper foothold, throwing himself against the rope, fighting for air, sweat prickling his body. His feet slipped with each step, so that he seemed to be walking on the spot, but he bent his head and he strained even more. The dish rose a foot out of the well. "Ah!" Charlie roared, staggering forwards, fists clenched, veins standing out in his forehead. "Come on, you rotten, stupid dish, come on!" With a horrendous screech, the metal container lurched out of the hole in the ground and landed with a crash, demolishing the wooden frame. Charlie collapsed, face down, his outstretched hands scraping along the floor of the vault, lacerating the skin on his palms. In an instant, he was back on his feet and unwinding the rope. He glanced over his shoulder. The metal dish lay on its side, and right behind it, the boy could see a gaping black hole in the vault floor. The well was open. The boy listened. At first, the only thing that he could hear was his own ragged breathing, but then he caught a noise, faint and far away, a noise that sounded like drumming. Mordred was coming. Charlie darted out to the vault, sped back through the tunnels. His arms and legs were pumping with all their might, but he concentrated on keeping his neck rigid and the beam of light steadily pointing downwards. If he stumbled and fell on the uneven floor, he would lose precious seconds, and that might make the difference between life and death. A blood-curdling roar echoed through the corridors behind him, and with a cry of fear, Charlie sprinted even faster. Reaching the bottom of the steps, he scrabbled up, slipping on the wet stone, using his hands to propel himself forwards. But he was going too fast to judge distance properly. As he launched himself through the little hole at the top, his helmet cracked on the jagged brickwork, and the light smashed, plunging him into utter darkness. Charlie's bout of terrified swearing was drowned out by another monstrous bellow, much closer than the last. The boy scrambled to his feet, began stumbling along the corridor, one arm scraping along the wall, the other waving blindly in front. The best he could now manage was a hesitant shuffle, and he knew that Mordred would catch him long before he could reach the big top. He didn't even know how to get back now, for he couldn't even see where the tunnels forked, never mind the chalk numbers telling him which passage to take. The trembling boy stopped, taking deep breaths, trying desperately to calm down. Wiping tears from his eyes, he peered into the blackness in a vain attempt to see something, anything, that might give him a clue to where the next turn-off lay. And there it was, a glowing pinpoint of light, punching a tiny hole in the darkness. Letting go of the wall, the boy staggered towards the glow, arms flailing out in front of him, his stumbling run gathering momentum until it ended in a headlong dive. His lungs emptied with a painful whoosh as he landed heavily on the rough floor, but his outstretched fingers closed round a little sparkling object. It was a juggling ball, and next to it was a hand-held torch. "Thank you, Lily," the boy breathed, switching on the light. The beam lit up a numbered fork to his left. It's only 2 feet away. There was another howl from Mordred, this time right behind Charlie. Then the boy was off again, racing up the passages, hurtling himself round dark corners and crawling along the last narrow tunnel like a jet-propelled mole. He burst into the maintenance vault, tearing the construction helmet from his head and flinging it across the room. Already he could hear a horrific rending of stone as something much larger and 1,000 times stronger than he was forced itself into the other end of the tunnel. Then Charlie was in the big top, running for the exit, grasping at Excalibur as he went past. The sword slid from the stone as easily as it had gone in, and seconds later the boy was standing with his back to the theatre door, the weapon held defensively in front of his face. The door that led to the workman's vault flew off its hinges in an explosion of shattered wood, and Mordred stepped into the big top. Oh my God. Charlie's face turned chalk white as he saw his opponent for the first time. Mordred was the height of a reasonably tall man, but there any resemblance with humanity stopped. He had heavily muscled arms that reached almost to his knees, and his spade-like hands ended in a rash of vicious yellow talons. The creature's legs were shorter and thick. There were hooves where his feet should have been, and his body was maggot white, hairless and laced with thick blue veins. But it was his face that shocked Charlie most. Mordred's angular head was bald, and his jaw jutted forward like a mechanical scoop lined with dozens of little piranha-like teeth. His ears were disproportionately large, set flat against the small scalp, but the rest of his features were almost non-existent. His nose was no more than a hole in the front of his face, and his eyes had retreated far into his skull, two glowing points of hatred burnt deep within his waxy flesh. The creature took a few lurching steps towards the boy, raising its talons as it approached. Charlie lifted his sword over his head and pointed it towards the beast. Like he had seen the ninjas do in kung fu movies, he hoped it looked impressive. "You're not getting past me, and I don't care how big you are." He tried to sound bold and manly, but the words came out in a series of trembling squeaks. "You've never heard of David and Goliath?" The monster stopped. A strange gurgling sound rose from somewhere inside its chest, and the jutting mouth split into a hideous upturned slash. Charlie realised with a growing horror that the creature was laughing. Then things got worse. "Brave boy," the troll gurgled. "Brave, even if you do hold the great sword." Mordred's speech was thick and vibrant, buzzing like a swarm of feasting flies, and despite his horror, Charlie was surprised to notice that the creature had a Scottish accent. The boy gripped the sword handle tighter. It occurred to him that Mordred hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 centuries. He might be inclined to chat for a while before tearing the boy limb from limb. Mordred looked around the big top with what Charlie presumed was a satisfied grin. "I cannot pass you while you have the weapon, as you surely know," he hissed, "but I do not need the door to escape. The poor walls of this dwelling are not like the thick stone of the prison where I suffered so long." He headed for the side of the big top, ignoring the boy. "I shall tear my way out with my bare hands." The boy kept quiet, Excalibur tight in his trembling fist. Mordred raised a taloned claw. Charlie held his breath. The creature stopped, sniffing suspiciously at the air around the wall. He turned his white mottled head and stared malevolently at the boy. The hair rose on the back of Charlie's neck. "Clever. So clever," the troll growled. "It's daylight outside, is it not? You tried to fool Mordred, clever little boy." He cantered back to the centre of the theatre, clicking his talons together as if considering his situation. "Clever little boy," he muttered again, "but Mordred can wait for night to fall. After all, I have waited for 16 centuries to be free. Can you imagine that, little boy?" Charlie shook his head. "No, Mordred can hardly imagine it himself, nor does he want to." The troll hunkered down in the middle of the big top. "After such a time, I can wait a few more hours." He laughed his bitter, gurgling laugh again. "I'll fight you," Charlie said in a tiny voice. His legs were trembling so badly he could hardly stand, and he felt sick and dizzy with fear. "Like you said, I have the sword. A Galhadrian is behind this," the creature whispered, tapping its head with a claw. "You would not do this on your own." It clicked its talons together again and rose to its feet. "Stalemate," it hissed. "I cannot defeat you, that is true, but you cannot catch me. At nightfall, Mordred shall simply tear his way through these puny walls to freedom. You cannot guard every exit." He turned and began to plod towards the back of the theatre. "I don't intend to," said Charlie quietly, looking up. 6 feet above his head, the safety net for the high wire act stretched from one side of the big top to the other. He bent his trembling knees, tensing all the muscles in his body, and leapt into the air. Slashing as high as the sword could reach, Excalibur's blade swept through the steel ropes, fastening the net to the wall as if they were thread. With a loud twang, one side of the mesh swept down, draping itself over Mordred. Charlie charged forward with a yell as the creature spun round, snarling. Through the safety net, though it was made of wire and coated with toughened rubber, the creature's talons sliced through the mesh as easily as Excalibur had. Mordred's arm shot through the hole torn in the fabric and grasped one of the metal posts that roped off the performance arena. He plucked it from the theatre floor as if it were a weed, and secured bolts popped out of the concrete like bullets, and flung the spike at the boy. Charlie dived as the post rocketed towards him, hunching his shoulders, tucking in his head the way he'd seen his parents do 100 times before. The metal bar whizzed past, inches over his head, and buried itself in the theatre wall. Charlie rolled out of the dive in time to see Mordred reaching for another post. With a grunt, he threw Excalibur straight at the creature. Mordred roared in defiance and launched himself sideways, rolling as effectively as Charlie had done, though the movement tangled him even more in the safety net. Excalibur sliced harmlessly past and clattered away at the back of the theatre, stopping next to the door that led back to the tunnels. Now Mordred was between Charlie and his only weapon. "The boy has lost the great sword," he cackled, slicing at the net again. "The boy is lost." But instead of turning back, Charlie headed straight for Mordred, the creature slashing wildly at the net, trying to free its arms properly, and its jagged rows of teeth slavered as it bit down on the wire strands. With every atom of his strength, Charlie leapt again, arms outstretched like a soaring bird, up over Mordred's head. The monster thrust one tangled arm skywards, claws glinting, but Charlie tucked his head down again and flicked his legs over his back. With a grace and skill that would have delighted his parents, he twisted in the air, arching over Mordred's outstretched arm, somersaulting perfectly and landing on his feet on the other side of the monster. Momentum kept him going, and he staggered to the back of the theatre, grabbing Excalibur from the floor, jumping, and slashed again the other side of the safety net, pinging it away from the wall and enveloping the creature once more. With a ferocious howl, Mordred tore into the new mesh folds with teeth and claws. Charlie reached down to a prop table, half hidden in the shadows, and picked up a small black box. He pointed it to the big top roof. "Welcome to the 21st century, he said, the tremble gone from his voice, and pressed a green button. With an electronic whir, the two halves of the theatre roof began to separate. Mordred's head shot up, and he gave a wail as a line of sunlight appeared on the theatre floor. He struggled out of the net and lumbered towards the back of the theatre, but now Charlie and Excalibur stood between him and the only way back into the tunnels. Behind the creature, a widening band of light danced and sparkled on the chrome and plastic of the theatre fittings. The monster looked at Charlie, clasping its clawed hands together as if in prayer. Tiny eyes, filled now with sadness and fear, burnt into the boy, and Charlie felt a sharp pain in his chest. Just for a second, he'd seen something terribly human in that stare. "Clever little boy," Mordred whispered, Softly as the sunlight reached him, Charlie's eyes widened in horror. Watching the light hit Mordred was like watching some huge deformed snowman caught in an inferno. The troll dissolved in front of his eyes, gobbets of flesh sliding from his body and hissing and bubbling like fat melting in a pan. Turning his head upwards, stretching out his mighty arms, Mordred let out one last agonising roar. Morgana! The sound echoed round and round the big top, but Mordred was gone, leaving nothing but a pool of rancid flesh on the theatre floor. Charlie dropped Excalibur, his chest heaving. "Well, Dad was right," he said, as his whole body began to shake. "This trip has certainly brought me out of my shell." He sank to his knees and he began to cry. Wow. Okay, teeth clean, wash hands, off to bed, big cuddle, and I'll speak to you tomorrow for the final chapter, The Thin Place. Hello there, my name is Sarah. I'm reading Secret City by Jan-Andrew Henderson, and this is the very final chapter, chapter 14, The Thin Place. Charlie's palms hurt, although they'd finally stopped bleeding. His crying had dried up too, and he sat quietly in the middle of the big top floor, looking like an exhausted clown. Face and hair white from the dust of the underground city, and the knees and elbows of his clothes worn away by crawling through the tunnel. His dishevelled appearance fitted the surroundings perfectly. The door to the workman's vault lay scattered in pieces across the theatre floor, and so did bits of Mordred. There was a metal pole sticking out of the big top wall, and the roof was gaping open to the sun. Oh, the roof! Charlie leapt to his feet, pointed the remote control and clicked. With a grinding sound, the metal flanges high above closed again. Anyone outside would simply presume the mechanism was being tested. The boy looked at his watch, was surprised to see it was only 7:30 a.m. Good. Not many people would be about, especially in this quiet little street. Hopefully, Mordred's dying yell would be mistaken for the Geronimo-style roar of a practising acrobat. The boy was so exhausted he could hardly think straight. But getting out of the wrecked theatre undetected certainly seemed a priority. He wondered where Lily was. He gave the remote control box for the big top roof a wipe with his T-shirt in case the police were inclined to fingerprint it, then prized Excalibur into the gap between the door frame and the theatre door and sliced through the hasp of the lock. Now investigators might think that the big top had been broken into and vandalised. Charlie wrapped the sword in the paint cloth and stuck his head nervously out the door. Nobody was about. He hurried up the sunlit wynd and turned the corner onto the high street without seeing another soul. At this time in the morning, even the high street was quiet, and the few passers-by didn't pay much attention to Charlie's tousled hair and torn clothes. The festival was filled with performers dressed in weird and wonderful costumes to promote their shows. Right now, there was a man dressed as a penguin on the other side of the street. He had to figure out what to do with Excalibur. The sword was worth a fortune. He had no doubt about that. But what use was that to him? If he tried to sell it, there would be all sorts of awkward questions like, what was a young boy doing with a 2,000-year-old sword made of metal that science couldn't explain? And if Lily was right, the sword wasn't meant for human eyes any more than Mordred was. The fairest thing that the boy could think of was to put Excalibur back where he found it. The graveyard was bound to be empty at this time of day, and he could go back there right now, replace the sword, and be back in his bed before his parents even woke up. Tucking Excalibur under his arms, he headed for Greyfriars. When he arrived, there was a small figure standing just outside the wrought iron gates, pressed against the wall as if trying to stay hidden from anyone in the cemetery. "Lily," Charlie said, surprised. "Get over here." Lily motioned nervously to him. When he got close enough, she reached out and pulled him away from the gates. "Are you all right?" "Mordred's dead." Charlie tapped his hand on the paint cloth, sharing the credit with the hidden sword. "I guessed that, otherwise you wouldn't be standing here." She clasped the boy's arm and shook it triumphantly. "You are something else, you know that?" "Thank you," Charlie blushed. But so much white dust was caked on his face, Lily didn't actually notice. Where are you going now? Are you going to put the sword back? She whispered. Yes, I am, said the boy proudly. Not so loud, Lily hissed. Listen, it's all very noble what you're doing, but it's not a great idea for you to go in there. Why not? I've been in before. Exactly, Lily said, glancing around nervously. You saw a white hawk with black-tipped wings, and there's no doubt that it saw you. So what? Charlie screwed up his face. I'm not a dormouse. The hawk is a lookout. Lily glanced up quickly at the clear blue sky. For us, for the little people, Greyfriars. It's a thin place, Charlie. You know what that is? I remember from Peasel's diary, yeah. The boy thought for a second. It's a place where the line between this world and Galhadria is almost non-existent. My people are determined to remain a secret to humans, Lily said. They let you take the sword in the hope you'll defeat Mordred, and you've certainly done that. She pointed at the paint cloth. But what do you think will happen if you go waltzing back there now? They'll know you've killed him. You've got bits of troll stuck in your boots. Charlie looked down. Oh, yeah. Do you think that'll come off? Even worse, you worked out who I am. The girl looked at him imploringly. Humans aren't supposed to know we exist, remember? You go in there, you'll never come out again. Charlie scowled. You Galhadrians aren't exactly big on gratitude, are you? No, we're not. It was Lily's turn to go red. As you so perceptively put it, we aren't big on anything except dancing, singing and enjoying ourselves. Helping others isn't high on our agenda. Then why don't you take the sword in for me? The boy held out the weapon. I can't. Lily stepped back, glancing around. I'm sure my people don't approve of me hanging around on Earth. If I set foot in there, they'd make me go back to Galhadria with them. What's wrong with that? Lily pushed the sword at her again. You put right what your father did wrong. Well, you used me to put it right. I had to, Charlie. I understand. He patted her arm. But while I'm being blunt, I looked apologetic. I don't think your father's ever coming back. Neither do I, Lily said sadly. I hoped someday he might return to rescue his followers or even come back for me. She sighed with a sudden cold wind, rustled through the gate. But as you said, we Galhadrians aren't big on gratitude. Well, I'm human. Charlie tucked the sword back under his arm, and I am putting Excalibur back where it belongs. He pushed at the gate, and the iron lattice swung open with a creak. Charlie! Lily hesitated and then stepped away from the wall. She fished in her pocket, brought out a small silver whistle, and handed it to him. If you are ever in trouble, and I mean real trouble, just blow and I'll be there, I promise. What about your no interfering with humans rule? Let's just say I owe you. I think I know why you want to stay on Earth. The boy grinned and gave her a knowing wink. After all this time, you're more human than Galhadrian. You're more magical than any human I ever met. She threw her arms round the boy and hugged him tightly. He held her awkwardly with one arm, the other still clutching the paint cloth. Goodbye, Charlie, she whispered. I hope someday we'll meet again. Then she turned and ran. Halfway down the street, she gave a small skip. Charlie watched her, getting further and further into the distance, until she looked just like any other girl in the world. The shovel was where Charlie had left it, lying next to Alan Ramsay's grave. The boy unwrapped Excalibur and stood over the area where the day before he had scraped away the soil. There was a large flat rock half hidden under dirt, probably a remnant of a headstone that had fallen over and been covered, but the boy knew Excalibur's power, and he plunged the sword down anyway. It sank easily through the stone and the packed earth below, right up to its hilt. Charlie hoped it hadn't gone through the remains of Alan Ramsay as well. He bent over to pick up the shovel. Once he'd covered the handle, Excalibur would remain hidden for many years to come. Well, well, there's an old friend, said a voice in his ear. He spun round to his amazement. Two boys were standing right behind him, one short and thin, the other tall and muscular, with long black hair. But it wasn't the clothes that gave Charlie the biggest start. The short boy wore a bright yellow waistcoat, +4s and a bowler hat. And the taller one was resplendent in full Highland regalia. We wanted to give you a proper welcome, said the bowler hat. so we dressed up in our finest togs. Aye, we didn't want to scare you, added the one in the kilt. Having just won a hand-to-hand combat with a vicious monster, Charlie was more astonished than alarmed. He simply stared, his mouth hanging open. The shorter boy stepped forward. The name's Peasel, he said, and this is my friend, Duncan. He shook Charlie's unresisting hand. Pleased to make your acquaintance. I know who you are. Charlie's face twisted into an incredulous smile. I recognise you. I don't know how I do. I just do. He let go of Peasel's hand. I can't believe this. Are you ghosts? You feel solid enough. Oh, we're real, Duncan laughed, and Peasel giggled as well. How can that be? The boy was as delighted as he was mystified. It's quite a strange explanation, said Peasel. I take it you read the diary? Charlie nodded. What did you think of the writing style? You can be honest. Peasel, the Highlander glowered at his friend. Just tell the story. Yeah, sorry. Well, when we beat the Galhadrian Wrath, Peasel hooked his thumbs into his waistcoat in preparation for his tale. Most of the Galhadrian Wrath, Duncan broke in, nodding graciously at Charlie, and the boy beamed with pride. Most of the Galhadrian Wrath, Peasel continued. Anyway, we came here afterwards with Shadowjack to bury the sword, and we wanted a secluded place to get the jewel out of the hilt. What happened? Charlie sat down on Alan Ramsay's tomb, enthralled. He was going to hear the end of Peasel and Duncan's story at last. We were starting to prize the jewel loose. We were surrounded by a group of little people, and they're not so little, let me tell you. They told us that Excalibur had not finished its work on Earth, Peasel sighed. Unfortunately, its work requires the jewel to stay in the hilt. They didn't trust us not to come back and dig it up later, Duncan added, so they took us back to Galhadria with them, Shadowjack as well. Peasel shrugged. We've been there ever since. But you're still young. That's the great thing about living with magical people, Peasel smiled. Long life and good health. I've had 200 years to study, more than anyone on earth. Always wanted to be a man of learning. The pickpocket sat on the tomb next to Charlie and put his arm around the boy's shoulder. There is so much I want to discuss with you. I'm particularly interested in mapping genomes and DNA splicing. Peasel's eyes were bright with exciting. How broad is your knowledge of genetic engineering? You must have seen some programs about it on your marvellous invention, the television. Not unless they made it into a cartoon. Peasel sighed. Charlie turned to Duncan. What have you been up to for 200 years? Looking for my brother. It was a long, uncomfortable silence. The Galhadrians claimed to have no knowledge of him, the Highlander said coldly. I searched their land anyway. Charlie removed Peasel's arm from his shoulder and stood up. So what are you both doing here? He asked wearily. Like us, you know too much about the existence of the little people. Duncan stood straight and tall, and his expression was impossible to read. We've been sent to bring you back with us to Galhadria. Yeah, I'd rather not. The boy started to back away. They thought we would be the best ones to fetch you, Peasel said sheepishly. It's not so bad there, really. Galhadria's beautiful, and I owe the little people my life. The Galhadrians are courteous enough, and they don't interfere in our lives. The boy was talking rapidly, trying to convince himself as much as Charlie. There are rivers and mountains for Duncan, and books for me to read, and we can look after you. Not a chance. The boy shook his head vehemently. I don't want to sound mean, but we're both orphans living in poverty. Actually have a life. Charlie, they'll take you whether you want to go or not. Then I'll have to fight on their hands. Then they'll have a fight in their hands, Charlie spat. I am out of here. Enough. The voice was low and clear and seemed to come from thin air. There was a sudden shimmer around Ramsay's grave, like a heat haze. Then the area around the tomb seemed to rupture. A narrow shaft of white light split the fabric of the air, and a stranger stepped through it into the graveyard. He was tall and thin, with red hair cascading around the angular face. Piercing green eyes matched his emerald tunic, and he wore a green kilt with a short sword fastened to a thick leather belt. The hour grows late, he said, bowing politely to Charlie. Soon humans will begin to enter this place. His hand whipped out at lightning speed and grabbed the boy's arm. The fingers were impossibly cold, and a bone-deep numbness immediately spread from Charlie's elbow to wrist. You have done us a great service, and you will be treated well. But Your fate cannot be altered. You must come with us now. Duncan and Peasel looked at each other and hung their heads. Take the sword back to Galhadria, Highlander, said the stranger to Duncan. That is where we all belong now. With a glowering look at the Galhadrian, Duncan bent over, grabbed Excalibur's hilt and pulled. The sword didn't budge. The Highlander planted his feet firmly in the ground, put both hands around the handle and pulled until veins stood out on his sinewy arms. He gave up and stepped back, a surprised look on his face. When you move? What? The Galhadrian looked at Charlie, then back at Excalibur. Stay there, he cautioned, walked around the flat tombstone to where the sword handle protruded from the soil. Charlie looked at the graveyard gate. It was 100 yards away, half hidden by the church, and he had no doubt the Galhadrian could catch him long before he got there. The stranger was standing over Alan Ramsay's grave now, clutching the sword. Charlie shuffled a few steps towards the flat tombstone, and as he did so, caught Peasel's eye. The pickpocket shook his head slowly, warning the boy not to try anything. Charlie held his gaze. Peasel shook his head again. Charlie shaped his mouth into one unspoken word. Please. Peasel bit his lip and then sighed and nodded. Duncan had caught the silent exchange, and without a change of expression, he edged closer to his friend. The Galhadrian was pulling with all his might on the handles of Excalibur, but the sword had not moved an inch. He stood up, the exertion on his face changed into astonishment. How did you do this? He demanded, stepping onto the flat tomb and towering over the boy. What have you done? Now! Shouted Peasel, and he and Duncan leapt as one. The boys hit the Galhadrian in a flying tackle, and all three tumbled off the tombstone in a tangle of arms and legs. Charlie launched himself forward, cartwheeling over the gravestone and landing in a crouch on the other side. He grabbed the sword handle and pulled Excalibur out to the ground in one fluid motion. The Galhadrian swept Duncan and Peasel away like toys and was on his feet in an instant, his face contorted with rage. Charlie was pointing the sword at his chest. I've already killed one magical creature today, he snarled. Would you like to be the second? But the Galhadrian was barely listening. He stood transfixed, staring at the sword in the boy's hand. Duncan and Peasel struggled to their feet, looking equally surprised. They'd expected Charlie to run for the exit. You took the sword from the stone, the Galhadrian said, awe in his voice. When we could not. So what? Excalibur did not waver in his hand. Is this a trick? The sword, Excalibur, has a power of its own. The Galhadrian shook his head. I will not let us wield it, and yet you can. I do not understand. He held up his hand in a gesture of truce. Perhaps the Grodin Wrath are not all dead. Whatever the reason, Excalibur's work is not done, and neither is yours. Charlie snorted. Oh, I think I've done all the work I'm going to do for you. That is your choice. The Galhadrian stepped back. But the sword will remain here in case you need it again someday. You may bury it and return to your world. I will not interfere. Charlie looked at Peasel and Duncan. His word is good, said Duncan. I'll vouch for that, at least. The boy lowered Excalibur. The air around the grave had begun to shimmer again. Farewell, Master Wilson, the Galhadrian motioned curtly to Peasel and Duncan. Come, he said brusquely, and stepped into the light without a backward glance. Duncan nodded to the boy. Good luck, Charlie, he said. He hesitated, then reluctantly followed the Galhadrian through the gateway to another land. Peasel stopped at the entrance to the light. Until we meet again, my friend, he said, doffing his hat. He stepped through into Galhadria. Charlie saluted him with his sword until the shimmer in the air faded away. Charlie's mother and father were sitting on the bed and looked up in surprise as their son walked into the room. The boy's hair was matted with dust and grime. His mud-spattered clothes were ripped and dirty, and there was a large blood stain down one side of his shirt. What on earth happened to you? His mother said, eyes wide. I've been practising, the boy replied, plonking himself on the bed between his parents. Mum, Dad, he said, putting an arm around each of them, I want you to teach me to be an acrobat. His parents stared at him and then at each other. Well, that's great, Charlie, his father said, unable to keep the astonishment out of his voice. He patted his son tentatively on the back. In fact, that's fantastic. We'd be delighted, Charlie. His mother smiled at him warmly and took his hand. There's plenty of stuff to learn, and we'll start whenever you like. Well, I've had a hard day. The boy let go of his parents, sank back wearily on his bed and closed his eyes. A slow smile spread across his face. But tomorrow, I think I'll start with a bit of juggling. Deep in a cavern, far to the north, a creature stirred. A huge, misshapen ear prickling up on its hairless head. Far away, the cry of her dying brother, borne on wind and wave, had wafted down to wreck her slumber. A tiny glowing eye opened in a mass of white flesh. Morgana was awake. I hope you've enjoyed that book, and I hope you also look up the follow-up to it, because that one is just as exciting. Clean your teeth, wash your hands, give yourself a great big huge cuddle. Stay safe.